Thought experiments are questions and scenarios used a lot in philosophy and science, designed to unravel complex questions and challenge the way we think about the universe. For example, there's Schrodinger's cat or the trolley problem. Here, we'll be talking about all of them. Just a quick disclaimer, nothing I present in this video is my opinion. Everything talked about is based on each experiment's view of the world. Metaphysics. We start with metaphysics. For those who don't know, it's a philosophy that deals with being and abstract concepts such as, are we real? Do we have free will? And is God real? Boltzmann brain. In an infinite universe, or one that lasts forever, it's entirely possible for random particles that could happen to come together and form a fully functional brain. This brain would exist briefly, floating in space, and could even have thoughts and memories. These memories would make it feel like it lived a full life, even though it just came into existence by chance. In a universe governed by entropy, most things naturally move towards disorder, but over long enough time, small random fluctuations can create order out of chaos. Given infinite time, the chances of something as complex as a brain forming randomly are very low, but not zero. In fact, over an infinite time span, it could happen countless times. If it's more likely for a single brain to form randomly than for an entire ordered universe like ours to exist, why do we see a universe full of structure, stars, planets, and life? Are we real beings in an actual universe, or are we just Boltzmann brains experiencing a fake reality made up by random thoughts in our spontaneously formed minds? So if Boltzmann brains are more probable than the entire ordered universes, then we might expect that most observers, statistically speaking, would be Boltzmann brains, but we see a universe with consistent laws of physics, complex systems, and billions of years of worth of history. Book of Life. Imagine you find a book in a library titled with your name. As you open it, you discover it describes your life in exact detail, including forgotten childhood memories that the book revives. Curious, you turn to today's date and find it describes your current actions, such as reading the book. It even predicts your future actions down to specific times and decisions. For example, it states that at 3:17 p.m. you will read this sentence. Determined to prove the book wrong, you close it to avoid fulfilling the prediction. Yet, as time passes, you absent-mindedly open it, only to find yourself reading the predicted sentence at the exact moment. Can you ever act contrary to the book's predictions? Every time you try to refute it, your actions somehow align with what was written. It appears you cannot escape the book's deterministic accuracy. This setup demonstrates that, in a determined world, deliberation, choice, and action may still feel voluntary, even though they are inevitable outcomes of prior causes. While it feels like you deliberate and choose freely, your choices are already part of a predetermined sequence. Does the inevitability of your actions undermine their meaningfulness, or is the act of deliberation itself sufficient to validate your sense of agency? Card predictor. Imagine a scenario where person A holds 6 black cards and 1 red card. They plan to lay the cards out one by one on the table. Person B claims they can predict which card A will play first. If B predicts black, A chooses to play the red card, and if B predicts red, A plays the black card instead. This dynamic seemingly allows A to defy B's prediction every single time. Does A's ability to choose contrary to the prediction prove they have free will? At first glance, it seems to demonstrate freedom of choice, as A can always act unpredictably. However, if B's prediction were based on knowledge of a determined future, where A's actions are already casually fixed, it challenges whether A's apparent ability to choose otherwise is real or illusionary. The scenario might suggest that determinism is incompatible with accurate prediction. If A's choices are influenced by B's prediction, then B's act of predicting affects the outcome, making a perfect prediction impossible. Curly Smith and the Trans-World Depravity. Imagine Curly Smith, a morally flawed person, exists in multiple possible worlds. In each world, Curly faces morally significant choices and always chooses wrongly. Even though he has the freedom to choose otherwise, it is argued that God, despite being omnipotent, cannot create a world where Curly can always choose rightly without overriding Curly's free will. This is because Curly's trans-world depravity ensures he would always freely choose wrongly in any scenario where he has genuinely moral freedom. This suggests that moral evil exists not because God lacks power or goodness, but because creating beings with true free will inherently allows the possibility of wrong choices. In Curly's case, his transworld depravity illustrates how free will can lead to moral failure across all possible worlds. Eternal recurrence. Suppose a demon approaches you and says, "This life you now live, and every moment within it will repeat eternally. Every joy, every sorrow, every thought, and every action will occur in the same sequence forever." How would you react to this? Would you curse the demon for imposing such an eternal loop? Or would you embrace the prospect of ultimate affirmation of life? Would living your life on repeat exactly as it is be a blessing or a curse? The initial response might be dread because eternal recurrence highlights every regret, failure, and pain without the possibility of change. However, to fully embrace eternal recurrence is to say yes to life in its entirety, including its suffering and limitations. Impossibility of conceiving the unconceived. Imagine trying to conceive of a tree in a forest that exists without anyone perceiving it. As you imagine it, you are perceiving it in your mind. This argues that it is impossible to truly conceive of an object that exists unperceived, because the act of conceiving involves perceiving. All objects we think are ultimately tied to perception. They are ideas in our mind. For example, if you find a book in an empty closet, the book exists as an idea you perceive in your thoughts, not as something independent of perception. Thus, objects are not independent physical substances, but collections of ideas perceived by minds. This rejects materialism, which holds that all objects exist independently in a physical world. Instead, objects only exist when perceived, either by humans or by a divine mind that ensures continuity when no human is perceiving them. Infant, inferior, or superannuated deity. If someone without prior belief in a perfect deity examined the evidence objectively, would they conclude that the universe was created by a wise and omnipotent God? The world might be a trial run of an infant deity still learning, a flawed creation by an inferior or subordinate deity, or the product of a superannuated god in their decline. The imperfections we observe, such as natural disasters, pain, and disorder, might be better explained by these scenarios than by the idea of a perfectly benevolent and omnipotent creator. Ingenious physiologist. Imagine you are connected to a machine operated by a highly skilled physiologist. By pressing buttons, the physiologist can induce anything in you, any desire or an intention they choose. For example, they press a button and you experience the volition to raise your hand, which you then do. They press another button and you suddenly feel the urge to kick, which you also do act upon. In each case, you act without its external force or obstacles, but every decision originates from the physiologist's intervention. So are you acting freely? According to compatibilists who believe free will can exist in a deterministic world, might argue that you are free because actions align with your desires. You willingly raise your hand or kicked, acting without compulsion or external interference. However, your desires themselves are externally determined by the physiologist. If your will is entirely shaped by external causes, can you truly be considered free? Even if you act on your desires, the fact that those desires are caused by something outside yourself seems to undermine true freedom. If all actions in a deterministic universe are ultimately caused by external factors, whether physiologist, genetics, or environment, does free will ever exist in a meaningful sense? If a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? Imagine a tree falls in a forest, crashing to the ground with tremendous force, yet no one is around to hear it. Does it make a sound? If you define sound as the physical vibrations traveling through the air, the answer seems straightforward. Yes, the tree does make sound. The falling tree generates air pressure waves, just as it would if someone were present. However, if sound is defined as the experience of hearing, a sensory perception in a conscious mind, then the absence of a listener means no sound occurs. Without ears to hear or a brain to interpret the vibrations, sound is the experiential sense that does not exist. This can go even deeper, questioning whether unobserved events exist in the same way as observed ones. The tree's sound waves can exist regardless of whether anyone hears them. On the other hand, without a perceiver, events like the tree's fall might still occur, but they lack qualities like sound that depend on sensory interpretation. Laplace's demon. Imagine a hypothetical being, later called Laplace's demon, that knows the exact position and velocity of every particle in the universe. If this being also understands all the laws of physics, it could calculate the entire past and future of the universe without perfect accuracy. The reasoning is based on where the behavior of objects follows specific predictable laws. For example, if you know the speed and direction of a moving object and all the forces acting on it, you can predict exactly where it will go. If every particle's state and all interactions are known, then the future isn't uncertain, it's just a matter of calculation. If the future is entirely determined by the present, then everything we do is simply a result of prior conditions. Every thought, decision, or action we take would be the inevitable outcome of a chain of cause and effect stretching back to the beginning of time. However, quantum mechanics introduces uncertainty at a fundamental level. For example, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle says that you can't know both the exact position and velocity of a particle at the same time. This makes perfect prediction impossible, even in theory. Additionally, chaos theory shows that even small uncertainties in initial conditions can lead to vastly different outcomes, making long-term predictions incredibly difficult. The Lost Island. This critiques the ontological argument for the existence of God, which claims that if we can conceive of the greatest conceivable being, it must exist. This reasoning is applied to an imagined lost island, a mythical place said to be more excellent than any other land, filled with riches and delights beyond comparison. If such an island exists in our understanding, and if existence in reality is greater than existence in thought alone, then the island must exist in reality. Imagining the most excellent island doesn't mean it must exist. Just as imagining a perfect island doesn't bring it into existence, conceiving of a perfect being or God doesn't guarantee its existence either. Lucretius' spear. Imagine someone runs to the edge of the universe and hurls a spear. The spear must either continue forward, indicating there's more space beyond, or it must hit a barrier. There must still be something beyond that barrier to stop it. In either case, space cannot be finite, it must be infinite. A finite edge implies the existence of something beyond it, whether that something is a form of space or a different dimension. Thus, the very concept of a boundary leads back to the notion of infinity. Merman's device. Imagine a machine called Merman's device. It has 3 buttons and 3 lights. Each button corresponds to a light, and the lights can flash either red or green. The device works according to specific rules, but those rules defy classical logic and intuition, making it a cornerstone for understanding quantum mechanics. You and a partner are given 2 separate identical devices. When you press a button on your device, it produces a light that flashes either red or green. The strange part is this: the patterns of lights on both devices is correlated, even if the devices are far apart. For example, if you press button 1 and your partner presses button 1, the lights might always flash the same color. But if you press button 1 while they press button 2, the lights might correlate in a way that can't be explained by any hidden mechanism or pre-programmed instructions. The device follows specific rules. If the color of the light depends on which button is pressed. If the same button is pressed on both devices, the light will always match. If different buttons are pressed, the correlation of lights depending on probabilistic rules, not classical logic. What's remarkable is that no classical explanation can account for these correlations. It suggests that the devices don't carry hidden information that determines their behavior in advance. Instead, their outcomes seem to be connected in a way that only quantum mechanics can explain, through a phenomenon called quantum entanglement. This essentially demonstrates the core mystery of quantum mechanics, how particles can exhibit correlations that classical physics can't explain. It highlights how reality at the quantum level defies intuition, forcing us to rethink the nature of information, causality, and locality. No space world. This imagines a reality where experience is purely auditory. There is no spatial dimensions or spatial senses. In this world, beings only perceive sounds with qualities like pitch, loudness, and timbre. but no spatial characteristics like distance or direction. Without space as we know it, the question is whether such beings could still conceptualize objective particulars, distinct things or identities. In our world, spatial relations make it easy to identify and refer to particular objects. For example, we can distinguish objects based on where they are located in space. In the no-space world, beings could use auditory continuity or discontinuity to achieve similar distinctions. For example, a continuous sound might signify one object, while a break could indicate a new one. These beings could theoretically develop a conceptual framework for distinguishing between things, even in the absence of space. It suggests that other conceptual schemes, like one based entirely on auditory experience, could exist. Norton's dome. A theoretical setup where a small object, like a particle, sits at the top of a perfectly symmetrical dome-shaped surface. The dome is shaped so that the force acting on the object at any point depends on its position in any specific mathematical way. The problem starts when the object is placed at rest exactly at the very top of the dome. According to Newton's law of motion, there's nothing to force the object to move. However, mathematically, the shape of the dome creates a strange situation. The object could spontaneously start sliding down the dome at any moment without any external force acting on it. This isn't a result of random forces, it's completely consistent with the equations of motion for the system. There's no way to predict when the object will start moving or in which direction. In classical mechanics, systems are usually deterministic. If you know the initial conditions, you can predict the future. But in this case, the equations allow multiple valid outcomes. The object could stay still forever or could spontaneously move. There's no way to determine whether or why. Halley's watch. Imagine finding a watch on the ground. Unlike a random stone, the watch's complexity, precision, and apparent purpose, telling time, leads us to conclude that it must have been designed by a watchmaker. Now, extending this analogy to the natural world, this intricate complexity of living organisms and the universe as a whole also point to the existence of an intelligent designer, God. Even if the watch occasionally malfunctions or if parts of it are difficult to understand, this does not negate the inference of a design. Similarly, imperfections in nature does not disprove the existence of a designer, but might reflect limits in our understanding of the design. Pascal's wager. This frames the question of if God exists as a gamble. God either exists or does not, and you must choose to believe or not believe. The wager evaluates the outcomes. If you believe in God and God exists, you gain infinite happiness in heaven. If you believe in God and God does not exist, you lose little or nothing. If you believe in God and God exists, you risk external suffering in hell. If you do not believe in God and God does not exist, you gain nothing. Belief in God is the rational choice because of the potential reward, eternal happiness, far outweighs the finite cost of belief, such as renouncing some earthly pleasures. Quantum suicide and immortality. Imagine a scientist conducting a highly unusual experiment using a quantum gun. The gun is designed to fire if a quantum event produces one outcome, and to misfire it, it produces another. The scientist aims the gun at their own head and pulls the trigger repeatedly. According to the laws of quantum mechanics, every pull of the trigger causes the universe to split into multiple branches, one where the gun fires and one where the gun misfires. But here's the catch. In any universe where the scientist dies, they are no longer conscious. From their perspective, they only ever experience the universe where the gun misfires. No matter how many times they pull the trigger, they survive. This experiment is designed to illustrate the implications of the many worlds interpretation, or the MWI, of quantum mechanics. According to MWI, every quantum event splits the universe into multiple branches, each representing a different possible outcome. In the case of quantum suicide, the experimenter's subjective experience is thought to follow only the branches where they survive, creating the illusion of immortality. If the many branches interpretation is correct, it suggests that in at least some branches of the universe, you continue to exist indefinitely, surviving even the most improbable scenarios. However, this quantum immortality applies only to your subjective experience. In the universes where the gun fires, others perceive you as dead, creating a disconnect between the subjective and objective realities. Resurrected people. Imagine a person, John, who suddenly vanishes in one place and reappears somewhere else with identical physical and physiological characteristics. Would this resurrected individual still be John? Now suppose John dies and an exact replica of him, complete with all of his memories, traits, and personality, is created in another realm, such as heaven. It's argued that if this replica is indistinguishable from the original in every meaningful way, it would still be reasonable to consider it the same person. This resurrected John would be continuous with the original, even though the physical body is not the same. This defends the plausibility of resurrection within religious contexts. He suggests that identity is not tied to exclusivity to the material body, but can be preserved through continuity of consciousness, traits, and memory. If a divine power could recreate these aspects perfectly, the resurrected person could still be considered the same individual. Rose fawn. Imagine a fawn caught in a forest fire caused by lightning. The fire severely burns the fawn, leaving it in agony for days before it eventually dies. The suffering appears to have no purpose. It doesn't contribute to any greater good, nor does it prevent any worse evil. If God exists, why would such apparently gratuitous suffering occur? This argues that while some suffering might serve a higher purpose, not all suffering can be justified in this way. The case of the fawn represents suffering that seems entirely unnecessary, challenging this traditional theistic view that God allows evil only as part of a greater plan. Sphere world. Imagine a two-dimensional being living on the surface of a sphere. To this being, their world appears flat and endless. They can move in any direction without ever encountering an edge. Yet unbeknownst to them, their flat surface serves back on itself in three-dimensional space. If they keep walking in a straight line, they'll eventually return to their starting point without realizing they've traveled a curved path. For two-dimensional beings, their reality is entirely confined to the surface of the sphere, like up or down, have no meaning, as they cannot perceive the third dimension in which their surface is embedded. We, as three-dimensional beings, might struggle to perceive higher dimensions, such as the two-dimensional beings that cannot grasp the true nature of a spherical world. We might be unable to fully comprehend a universe that extends beyond our familiar three dimensions. For example, our universe is a three-dimensional surface embedded in a higher dimensional space. We might perceive it as infinite or flat, even if it has a finite curved structure. Einstein's theory of general relativity describes how massive objects curve space-time, creating a geometry that we navigate without directly perceiving its higher dimensional shape. Similarly, in cosmology, the universe is often molded as a three-dimensional surface with possible curvature, much like the two-dimensional sphere. Schrödinger's cat. Imagine a sealed box containing a cat, a vial of poison, a radioactive atom, and a Geiger counter. If the atom decays, a random quantum event, the Geiger counter, detects it, breaking the vial and releasing the poison, killing the cat. If the atom doesn't decay, the cat remains alive. But here's the twist. Quantum mechanics tells us that the atom is in superposition of decayed and undecayed states until it's observed. Since the cat's fate is tied to the atom, it too exists in superposition, both alive and dead, until someone opens the box and looks inside. Observation collapses the superposition into one definite state. Before that, the cat isn't alive or dead, it's in a probabilistic blur of both. Other interpretations, like the many worlds theory, suggest that the universe splits when the box is opened. One where the cat lives and another where it dies, both equally real. Teletransportation paradox. Imagine stepping into a teleporter, a machine that promises to instantly transport you into another location. It works by scanning your body at the molecular level, destroying your original form, and recreating an identical version of that destination. Every atom is reconstructed perfectly, and the new you has the same memories, personality, and physical characteristics. Here's the question. Is the person who steps out of the teleporter you, or just a copy? If the teleporter destroys your original body, does that mean the original you is gone forever, leaving only a duplicate? Or does your identity transfer seamlessly into the new body, making the destruction irrelevant as long as the copy is perfect? From a physical perspective, the teleported individual might appear identical in every way. They'd have your memories, recognize your loved ones, and even believe they are you. But from a philosophical standpoint, many argue that destroying the original body creates a discontinuity in consciousness. The you who steps into the teleporter might cease to exist, and the you who steps out is merely a replica, no matter how perfect. If identity is tied to the continuity of physical form or consciousness, the teleporter might be killing the original person and creating a new one. On the other hand, if identity is defined by the preservation of information, your memories and personality, then teleportation might be considered a form of survival, even if it involves destruction and recreation. Would you use a teleporter if it meant your original self is destroyed? Would society consider the teleported person legally and morally the same as the original? And how would we reconcile this with our intuitions about the value of the individual existence? The Library of Babel. An infinite library containing every possible book. The books are identical in format, 410 pages, each filled with random combination of 25 characters, the 26 letters of the alphabet, the comma, the period, and the space. Somewhere in this vast collection is a book that perfectly describes your life, one that contains the complete works of Shakespeare, and even one that answers every scientific or philosophical question ever asked. But the overwhelming majority of books are incomprehensible gibberish. The library represents the idea of a universe that contains every possible combination of information. It is complete, holding all knowledge, truth, and falsehood simultaneously. Yet, this completeness makes it overwhelmingly chaotic. For every meaningful book, there are countless meaningless ones, making the process of finding useful information nearly impossible. If everything that could ever be written or known exists in this library, what value does any single book hold? Even if you found a book that seemed meaningful, how could you trust it when another book might contradict it word for word? The library embodies both infinite potential and infinite futility. The Library of Babel also raises questions about randomness and order. Within its structure, patterns occasionally emerge, but they are indistinguishable from the randomness that dominates. This parallels philosophical debates about the universe. Is it a chaotic collection of possibilities, or is there an underlying order waiting to be discovered? The problem of evil. In a world created by an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God, such a being would have the power to prevent evil, the knowledge to foresee it, and the goodness to desire a world without it. Yet, we live in a world filled with suffering, injustice, and evil. Why does this God allow it to exist? The question of how existence of evil can be reconciled with the concept of a benevolent and omnipotent deity. The argument is often framed as followed. If God is powerful, he could prevent evil. If God is all-knowing, he knows evil exists and how to stop it. If God is perfectly good, he would want to eliminate all evil, yet evil exists. The apparent contradiction between these premises lead to the question either the nature of God or the validity of belief in such a being. God could possibly allow evil because it is a consequence of granting humans free will. For love, morality, and meaningful choices to exist, human must have the freedom to choose, even if that freedom leads to evil actions. However, this raises further questions. Could an omnipotent God create a world where free will exists without suffering? And does this explanation account for natural evils like earthquakes or diseases, which don't result from human choice? The time-freezing world. Imagine a world divided into 3 regions, A, B, and C, where local freezes periodically occur. During a freeze, all activity in a region stops, no motion, growth, or decay. Observers in unfrozen regions can see the frozen area in static, but those within the frozen region are unaware of the freeze, as their perception also halts. Region A freezes every 3 years, Region B freezes every 4 years, and Region C every 5 years. Based on this cycle, the inhabitants calculate that every 60 years, a simultaneous freeze would occur in all 3 regions at the same time. During this total freeze, no processes occur anywhere in the world, yet once it ends, the inhabitants find everything resumes, as if no time had passed within the frozen intervals. This raises a question. If nothing changes during a total freeze, can time still pass? This argues that yes, suggesting that time can exist independently of observable change. The freezes are conceptually possible because, even without change, the overall pattern of freezes and their resumption allows for the measurement of time after the fact. Two-space myth. Imagine your dream life becomes coherent and continuous. Every night, as you fall asleep in your everyday world, you wake up in a vivid, entirely separate world, a hut by a tropical lake. In this second world, you have a different identity, relationships, and responsibilities. Injuries, actions, and relationships in one world have consequences only in that world. The two worlds are distinct yet equally real. For instance, after a long day in the tropical world, you fall asleep in your hut, only to wake up in your home in the everyday world. Over time, these transitions are seamless, with each world maintaining its own consistent and logical framework. People in each world confirm your experiences there as real and reliable. Is it conceivable to live in two independent yet equally real spaces? The two worlds, though separate, could be considered equally real because each is coherent and operates under its own rules. If there are no spatial connections between them, does that mean we are living in two separate spaces, or is our notion of space just an arbitrary framework tied to our experiences? Voluntary prisoner. Imagine a man who is carried asleep into a locked room containing someone who is eager to see. Upon walking, he's delighted to find himself in the company of this person and chooses to stay. Although his decision to remain is voluntary, he wants to stay. He's not free because he has no actual option to leave as the door is locked. Voluntary actions do not necessarily imply freedom. Freedom requires not just the ability to act according to one's desires, but also the genuine ability to choose otherwise. The man's stay is voluntary because it aligns with his preference, but he is not free because leaving is impossible. This challenges the concept of free will, arguing that the terms freedom and will are distinct and should not be conflated. The will refers to the capacity to choose among options, while freedom pertains to the ability to act on those choices. Therefore, questions about free will are misguided. The proper question is whether a person is free to act as they will. Willing addict. Imagine a person who is addicted to drugs, but fully embraces their addiction. If the grip of their addiction weakens, they would actively take steps to restore it, ensuring their desire for the drug remains strong. The question is, does this addict have free will? Free will isn't about the ability to do otherwise. Instead, it's distinguished between two levels of desires. First-order desires, which are the immediate wants, example, wanting the drug, and second-order desires, which are desires about desires, example, wanting to continue wanting the drug. When a person's first-order desires align with their second-order desires, this can be a form of free will. In the addict's case, they not only desire the drug, but also desire to maintain that desire. Thus, the willing addict has free will because their actions reflect their deeper values and desires. Long-neglected garden. Imagine two people returning to a garden they left unattended for a long time. Among the weeds, they find a few original plants thriving. One person concludes that a gardener must have tended to the plants. The other disagrees, pointing out that no one has seen or heard anyone working in the garden, when the presence of weeds suggests neglect, not care. The first person insists that the arrangement of plants reflects on purpose and beauty, suggesting an invisible gardener who works unseen and unheard. They argue that the further careful observation will reveal confirmation of this belief. However, as both individuals study the garden in greater detail, the evidence they uncover remains ambiguous. Some findings support the idea of a gardener, while others suggest neglect or malicious interference. Despite having the same observations and knowledge, one person continues to believe in the gardener, while the others do not. Both individuals agree on the fact of the garden, but they draw different conclusions on what those facts mean. And scenario shows that belief is often shaped by subjective perceptions, values, and predispositions rather than empirical data alone. World with flexible laws of nature. Imagine a world where physical laws could be altered or suspended whenever it would benefit the inhabitants. For example, if someone were about to fall from a great height, gravity could momentarily weaken to ensure a safe landing. Similarly, natural disasters or accidents can be avoided by adjusting the environment's rules as needed. In a flexible world, individuals will lack the ability to predict outcomes or develop a reliable understanding of cause and effect. Scientific inquiry, technological advancement, and personal responsibility would be undermined, as people cannot trust the consistency of natural laws. This could lead to chaos, as actions will no longer have predictable consequences. This also suggests that a world with fixed laws allows for a genuine moral and spiritual development. In a consistent world, individuals face real challenges and consequences, fostering growth, creativity, and ethical decision-making. By contrast, a flexible world might eliminate suffering but also remove the opportunity for individuals to develop virtues like courage, perseverance, and compassion. Xenos' Achilles. This presents a scenario where Achilles, a swift runner, races a tortoise. The tortoise is granted a head start. Achilles first has to reach the point where the tortoise began, but by then, the tortoise will have moved forward. Achilles must then reach this new position, during which the tortoise moves again. This sequence theoretically continues infinitely, with Achilles perpetually closing the gap but never overtaking the tortoise. This paradox extends to any motion. To traverse a distance, one must first cover half, then half of that remaining half, and so on. These divisions create an infinite number of steps to cover any distance, suggesting that motion is logically impossible under these conditions. However, in reality, Achilles obviously overtakes the tortoise. This paradox leverages the concept of infinite divisibility, posing that even finite actions like reaching a finish line require completing an infinite series of steps. This challenges intuitions about motion and time, questioning how finite results arise from infinite sequences. Mathematically, modern calculus resolves the paradox by summing the infinite series into a finite total, explaining how Achilles indeed overtakes the tortoise. Philosophy of mind. This branch of philosophy is essentially about the relationship between the body and mind. Antipodeans. Let's say there's a society, the Antipodeans, who completely lack concepts of mental states. Unlike us, they describe all behavior and experiences purely physical terms, such as brain processes and neural activity. For example, instead of saying I feel pain, they might say C fibers are firing. Despite this difference in language, the Antipodeans live rich, communicative, and functional lives. The central question is whether their lack of mentalistic concepts undermines their understanding of consciousness. This scenario argues that the way we describe experiences mentally or physically is largely a matter of linguistic and cultural convention, not an essential feature of consciousness itself. If the Antipodeans' descriptions are just as effective as ours in predicting and explaining behavior, does this mean that mental terms like pain or joy are unnecessary? The divide between mental and physical might be less significant than we think. It aligns with eliminative materialism, the view that our mentalistic vocabulary might eventually be replaced by more precise physical explanations as neuroscience advances. The bat. Imagine a bat, a creature that perceives the world primarily through echolocation, a sensory experience entirely alien to humans. We can study a bat's biology, map its brain processes, and understand how echolocation works in scientific terms. However, it's argued that none of this objective knowledge can tell us what it's like to be a bat, to experience the world the bat does. Consciousness is fundamentally subjective. It involves a first-person perspective that cannot be fully captured by third-person scientific descriptions. For instance, while we might imagine being a bat, we are doing so from a human experience. Projecting our own sensory framework onto the bat's existence, we can never truly grasp the bat's subjective reality. Even if we completely understand the mechanics of the brain and sensory systems, we still lack insight into the subjective quality of experiences, what it feels like to be an individual with a specific form of consciousness. Blockhead. Imagine a machine that perfectly simulates human conversation. It doesn't think, understand, or have consciousness, but it has been programmed to respond to any possible input with pre-written, contextually appropriate replies. If you engage with it, you never know if it wasn't human. It passes every test of linguistic and conversational ability. Does this machine truly understand, or is it merely a complex blockhead? While the machine behaves indistinguishably from a human in conversation, it lacks the capacity for comprehension, learning, or conscious thought. Its responses are predetermined, not the product of reasoning or awareness. This raises a critical question. Is intelligence defined by outward behavior, or does it require inner processes like understanding and awareness? Brain replacement. Imagine a scenario where parts of your brain are gradually replaced with functionally identical silicon chips. These chips replicate the neural activity of the replaced brain tissue, ensuring that your behavior and cognitive abilities remain unchanged. As the process continues, you outwardly appear the same and interact normally with others, but it introduces two possibilities for your subjective experience. You remain conscious and experience no difference as the silicon chips perfectly emulate the original brain functions. Your consciousness gradually fades or is completely lost despite your outward behavior remaining unchanged. Internally, you might feel yourself becoming less aware or entirely cease to experience anything. Is consciousness merely a product of the brain's functional processes, or does it require something intrinsic to biological neurons? If silicon chips can replace neurons without lost consciousness, this supports functionalist and physicalist theories which argue that consciousness arises from organization and interaction of the physical systems regardless of their material composition. Brainstorm machine. Imagine a device that could record every thought in your mind, displaying them for all to see. This machine doesn't just capture your conscious thoughts, but also uncovers subconscious ideas, fleeting notions, and even secrets you may not admit to yourself. Once connected, anyone could observe the raw stream of your mind, from mundane reflections to deep, personal, and troubling revelations. How would relationships change if every hidden intention or unspoken feeling became visible? For example, consider a scenario where a close friend connects to a machine and discovers a harsh thought you had about them during a fleeting moment of anger. You didn't mean it, and you never acted on it, but now they know. Would they forgive you, or would this transparency undermine trust? In a world where thoughts are visible, does privacy even exist? Beyond individual consequences, imagine this technology applied at a societal level. Government, employers, or law enforcement can monitor thoughts to preempt crimes or ensure compliance with societal norms. Would this lead to a safer world, or a dystopian one where the people live in fear of their own minds betraying them? Breitenberg vehicle. These vehicles are simple robots that demonstrate how complex behavior can emerge from straightforward systems, without any explicit programming for higher-level intelligence. A Breitenberg vehicle is typically imagined as a small wheeled robot equipped with sensors like light or heat detectors and motors. The sensors and motors are connected in various ways to produce different behaviors. For example, if each sensor is linked directly to the motor on the same side, the vehicle might turn towards or away from the light source depending on how the connections are arranged. The simplicity of the design allows these vehicles to display behaviors that appear intelligent, such as the approaching a light, avoiding it, or even exploring their environment. This shows how behavior that seems purposeful or even emotional can arise from purely mechanical and deterministic processes. For example, attraction to a light source. If the vehicle's sensors are connected so that more light increases the speed of opposite side motor, the vehicle turns toward and move towards the light. This can look like curiosity or desire. More complex behaviors, like adding more sensors, more intricate connections, can result in vehicles that seem to exhibit aggression, love, or exploratory behavior, all without any actual consciousness or intent. The key insight is that observers often attribute these behaviors to the vehicle having goals or emotions, even though the system is purely mechanical. This highlights how humans naturally interpret behavior through a lens of an intentionally, even when none exists. Chinese nation. Imagine that every individual in China is assigned a role of a single neuron in the human brain. Using radios and other communication devices, they collectively simulate the neural activity of a brain, mimicking its functional organization perfectly. The question is, would this system, functionally equivalent to a brain, possess consciousness? While the Chinese nation system might replicate the functional behavior of a brain, it seems implausible that it would have subjective experiences or qualia. The individuals acting as neurons would not individually or collectively experience thoughts, sensations, or emotions, even though the system performs the same function as a conscious brain. This highlights a key issue in functionalism. It focuses on the replication of functions without necessarily addressing the underlying nature of consciousness. The Chinese room. Imagine a person who does not understand Chinese sitting in a room with a set of rules that tells them how to manipulate Chinese symbols. When given a question in Chinese, the person uses the rules to produce a response in Chinese, which is indistinguishable from one given by a fluent speaker. To an outside observer, it seems as though the person understands Chinese. However, it's argued that the person is merely following the syntaxical rules without any comprehension of the language. Does the ability to produce intelligent seeming outputs mean the system understands? This experiment says that it doesn't. The person in the room does not know what the symbols mean. They are manipulating them according to the formal rules. Similarly, a computer might process data and produce outputs, but this does not mean it has any understanding or subjective experience. True understanding requires semantics, or meaning, not just syntax, which is rule-following processes. Happiness pump. Imagine a person who dedicates their entire life to maximizing happiness, not just for themselves, but for everyone. Every action they take is meticulously calculated to create the greatest possible amount of happiness in the world. They sacrifice their own desires, relationships, and even personal identity to achieve this goal. This person is a happiness pump. A happiness pump might prioritize saving the lives of many strangers over spending time with loved ones. They might justify harming themselves or others in small ways if it leads to greater happiness overall. This pursuit of maximizing happiness can lead to absurd or morally questionable actions, such as neglecting personal well-being or exploiting individuals for the greater good. If it is realistic or even desirable for anyone to live as a happiness pump, sacrificing everything for the greater good, most people value a balance between altruism and personal fulfillment, suggesting that morality might require more than just calculating outcomes. Imitation game. The game involves 3 participants, a human interrogator and 2 entities, 1 human and 1 machine, placed in separate rooms. The interrogator communicates with both via written messages, asking questions to determine which is the human and which is the machine. The machine's goal is to imitate the human responses so convincingly that interrogators cannot reliably distinguish it from human. This test was proposed as a way to sidestep the philosophical debate over what constitutes thinking. Instead of trying to define thought, the test evaluates whether a machine's behavior is indistinguishable from that of a human. If a machine could consistently fool the interrogator, it is deemed to exhibit intelligence. Zombies. Imagine a being that is physically identical to a human in every way. It has the same brain structure, physiology, and outward behavior. However, unlike humans, this zombie lacks subjective experience or qualia. It doesn't feel pain, see colors, or have any inner experience, even though it behaves as it does. This raises a question in philosophy of mind. Can consciousness be fully explained by physical processes? If such a zombie is conceivable, it suggests that subjective experience is not necessarily tied to the physical workings of the brain. In other words, there could completely be a physical duplicate of a person that lacks consciousness. Toxin puzzle. Imagine someone offers you a fortune, but with one condition. You must intend to drink a toxin that will make you sick for a day, but you don't actually have to drink it. The catch? You only get the money if at a specific moment you genuinely intend to drink the toxin, even though you're free to change your mind later. Can you do it? The problem seems simple. Why not just form the intention to drink the toxin, claim the money, and then choose not to drink it? But genuine intention isn't something you can fake. To truly intend to drink the toxin means fully committed to following through, even though you know you won't actually have to. Rationally, once you've secured the money, there's no reason to drink the toxin. So how can you honestly form an intention to do something that you know you have no reason to do? Intentions are forward-looking. They commit you to future actions, but in this case, once the money is secured, drinking the toxin is no longer serves any purpose. Rationality would dictate abandoning the plan, yet the prize depends on forming a sincere intention in the first place. Can you will yourself into truly intending something when deep down you know you won't or shouldn't do it? It also raises questions on how we make decisions. Is it rational to form intentions based on hypothetical scenarios, or does true intention require alignment with future actions? Leibniz's machine. Imagine a machine that thinks, perceives, and feels. If such a machine existed, we could enlarge it to a size where we could enter it, examine its parts, and observe its internal mechanisms. Despite inspecting all of its components and understanding how they interact, we will only see physical processes, wheels turning, gears moving, with no evidence of conscious experience, such as thoughts or feelings. Physical systems alone cannot explain consciousness. Even if the machine replicates the functions of the mind, its operations will remain mechanical and devoid of subjective experience. This leads to the conclusion that something non-physical, such as the soul or immaterial mind, is necessary to amount for consciousness. Martian scientist. Imagine a highly advanced Martian scientist who knows everything there is to know about physics, chemistry, and biology. This Martian has a complete understanding of the human brain and nervous system down to the finest detail of its structure and function. Yet the Martian has never experienced human sensations. No taste of chocolate, no sound of music, no feeling of pain. So the question is, can the Martian fully understand what it's like to be human without ever experiencing these sensations? If the Martian's knowledge is complete, but still lacks an understanding of subjective experiences, it suggests that these experiences cannot be reduced to physical facts. For example, while the Martian might understand every neuron involved with the sensation of pain, they may not know what it feels like to suffer pain without indirectly experiencing it. Proponents of the thought experiment argue that the raw subjective aspects of experience are fundamentally different from physical facts. They claim that understanding the brain's mechanisms is not the same as understanding the lived experience of being a conscious being. Knowledge argument. Mary is a scientist who spent her life in a black and white room. Despite her limited environment, she becomes an expert on the science of color, learning everything about its physical properties, such as wavelengths, neurological responses, and how humans perceive it. However, Mary herself has never experienced color firsthand. One day, Mary leaves the room and sees a red apple for the first time. The question is, does Mary learn something new? It's argued that she does. Although Mary knew all the physical facts about color, experiencing red introduces her to something that she couldn't have learned through physical descriptions alone, what it feels like to see red. This suggests that there is more to knowledge than just physical information. There are subjective experiences that cannot be captured by purely physical explanations. The Swamp Man. Imagine you're walking through a swamp when suddenly a bolt of lightning strikes, vaporizing you instantly. At the same moment, another lightning strike hits the swamp nearby, rearranging molecules to create an exact physical duplicate of you, down to the last atom. This duplicate, called Swamp Man, looks like you, thinks like you, and even has all your memories. It goes on to live your life, interacting with all your friends, working your job, and continuing as if nothing unusual happened. But is the Swamp Man you? Swamp Man is physically identical to you in every way, but it lacks any casual history. It wasn't born, didn't grow up, and didn't form relationships. Despite its perfect imitation, Swamp Man cannot truly have the same thoughts or intentions as you because meaning and understanding arise from a being's interactions and history within the world. For example, when Swamp Man remembers your childhood, it doesn't actually have those experiences. There's just patterns in its brain that mimic memories. Similarly, when Swamp Man uses language, its words might appear meaningful, but that they lack the historical and social context that gives them true significance. Brain in a vat. Imagine a brain removed from a human body and placed in a vat of life-sustaining fluid. Electrodes connecting the brain to a supercomputer, which sends its electrical signals identical to those of the real body and environment will provide. As a result, the brain experiences a simulated reality indistinguishable from the real world. For example, if a computer sends signals corresponding to walking in a park, the brain feels like it's walking in a park, even though it's just floating in a vat. This raises the question, how can we know that our perceptions correspond to reality? For all we know, we might be brains in a vat, living in a complete simulated world. If our perceptions are entirely mediated by external signals, distinguishing between reality and simulation becomes impossible. This argues against radical skepticism, which claims that we cannot know whether the external world exists. It suggests that the very act of thinking, I am a brain in a vat, refutes the hypothesis. According to this, for the statement to be meaningful, the terms brain and vat must refer to the actual things in the real world. However, if we were in a simulated reality, our terms could only refer to the simulated concepts, not the real-world objects they are supposed to describe. Thus, the hypothesis self-destructs. It cannot be coherently be true. Body exchange. This one explores a scenario where two individuals, A and B, undergo a mind swap. Imagine that A's consciousness, including memories, personality, and physiological traits, is transferred into B's body, and vice versa. After the procedure, the question arises, who is who? One answer is that A is now in B's body and B is now in A's body. This view aligns with the psychological continuity theory of identity, which holds that personal identity is tied to the mind rather than the body. If A's memories and mental life persists in B's body, then A's identity follows those physiological traits, not the physical form. However, this scenario is made more complex by introducing scenarios involving threats to one of the bodies. For example, imagine that A's former body, which is now inhabited by B's mind, is scheduled for punishment. Who would feel fear or concern? If we instinctively feel that A's identity remains tied to the original body, this challenges the idea that psychological continuity alone defines personal identity. People often associate identity with the body, especially in cases involving physical harm or survival. Brave officer. Imagine a young boy who steals an apple. Later in life, as a brave officer, he remembers stealing the apple as a child. Much later, as an old general, he remembers his exploits as a brave officer but has forgotten the incident of stealing the apple. According to this, the boy, the officer, and the general are the same person if there is continuity of memory linking them. However, it points out a contradiction. If the general remembers being the officer but not the boy, the general is no longer the same person as the boy, despite being connected to the officer. Yet the officer remembers being the boy, meaning the boy and the officer are the same person. This creates a logical inconsistency because identity, as this defines it, would no longer be transitive. This shows problems with memory-based theories of identity. They rely on direct memory connections, which can be incomplete or inconsistent over time. It argues that personal identity is based on the continuity of the self as a whole, not just on the ability to remember specific events. For this, identity is a matter of being the same substance or individual, regardless of whether certain memories are accessible. Charles and Guy Fawkes. Imagine Charles, a contemporary person, and Guy Fawkes, the historical figure known for the gunpowder plot. In this experiment, Charles's memories, personality, and consciousness are transferred into the body of Guy Fawkes, while Fawkes' memories and personality are transferred into Charles' body. The question is, which person has which identity after the switch? Intuitively, we might say that individual in Guy Fawkes' body, who now has Charles' memories and personality, is Charles, while the individual in Charles' body, who now has Guy Fawkes' memories, is Guy Fawkes. This aligns with the psychological continuity view of personal identity, where identity is tied to memory and consciousness rather than physical body. Divided self. This imagines a scenario where a person's brain is split into two hemispheres, and each hemisphere is transplanted into a separate body. After the procedure, two individuals exist, each with half the original brain, and seemingly complete memories and personality traits of the original person. The question arises, who is the original person, if anyone? The scenario challenges traditional views of identity based on psychological continuity. If both new individuals have equal claims to being the original person, does that mean the original person is now two distinct beings? Or does the division result in the original person ceasing to exist entirely with the creation of two new individuals? The thought experiment highlights the difficulty of applying concepts like identity to cases involving duplication or division. E. coli John. Imagine a man named John, whose every thought and action are the result of the colony of E. coli bacteria in his gut. This bacteria releases chemicals that determine John's mental states and decisions. John believes he is acting freely, but in reality, his choices are entirely dictated by the activity of the bacteria. Does John have free will? If his actions and thoughts are completely determined by the bacteria, it challenges the notion that John is a free agent, capable of making independent decisions. On one hand, John's experience of deliberation and choice might feel real, but his behavior is caused entirely by external forces, in this case, the E. coli. If all of John's actions are casually determined by bacteria, can he still be held morally responsible for them? The subjective feeling of freedom might coexist with determinism. Even if external forces dictate behavior, the experience of agency remains intact, challenging how we define free will. Fission. This imagines a scenario where a person's brain is divided and each hemisphere is transplanted into a separate new body. After the procedure, two individuals emerge, each with half the original brain, sharing the memories, personality, and psychological traits of the original person. So the question is, what happens to the identity of the original person? So there are three main possibilities. The first one is the original person ceases to exist. Since the original person's identity cannot be split into two, they're no longer present. The two new individuals are distinct from the original person and from each other. The second one is the original person survives as one of the two individuals. This raises the problem of arbitrariness. Why would the original person's identity persist in one individual over the other, given they are psychological identical? And the last one, the original person survives as both individuals. This suggests that personal identity is not singular and that one person can split into two, challenging the traditional notion of identity as a one-to-one relationship. Personal identity is not what fundamentally matters. Instead, it emphasizes psychological continuity and connectedness. From this perspective, the survival of the original person's traits, memories, and personality in the two new individuals is what truly matters, not the preservation of a singular, continuous identity. Prince and Cobbler. Imagine a scenario where the consciousness of a prince, complete with all of his memories, thoughts, and personality, is transferred into the body of a cobbler. Meanwhile, the cobbler's consciousness is transferred into the prince's body. After the switch, the individual in the cobbler's body retains the prince's identity, while the individual in the prince's body retains the cobbler's identity. Personal identity is not tied to the physical body, but to continuity of consciousness. The prince remains a prince because his memories and mental life persists, even though he now inhabits the cobbler's body. Similarly, the cobbler's identity follows his consciousness, regardless of his new royal appearance. This thought experiment introduces a distinction between two key concepts of identity: personal identity and bodily identity. The Shoemaker's Brownson. Imagine two individuals, Brown and Robinson, each with their own distinct body and brain. Due to an accident, Brown's brain is transplanted into Robinson's body. After the operation, the resulting person, called Brownson, has Brown's memories, personality, and psychological traits, but Robinson's physical body. Who is Brownson? Is he Brown because he retains Brown's mental continuity, or is he Robinson because he inhabits Robinson's body? It's argued that personal identity is more closely tied to psychological continuity than physical form. Brownson remembers being Brown, thinks like Brown, acts like Brown, even though he now occupies Robinson's body. Thus, Brownson is more reasonably identified as Brown. The Ship of Theseus. This scenario begins with the famous Ship of Theseus. A ship, over time, has its wooden planks replaced one by one until none of the original planks remain. The question is the fully replaced ship still the Ship of Theseus, or has it become a new identity? Now, suppose all of the original planks are collected and reassembled into a second ship. Now, which is the true Ship of Theseus? Is it the one that has been continuously maintained and sailed, or the one reconstructed from the original materials? Is identity tied to the continuity of form and function, the ship that was maintained and used, or the original materials, the reconstructed ship? Does the identity of an object depend on its physical composition or its purpose and function? If it's the latter, the maintained ship might be considered the true Ship of Theseus because it retains its operational form. How do we define what makes something the same? The thought experiment challenges the assumption that identity is static and straightforward, suggesting instead that it may depend on context and perspective. Whose body is it anyway? Imagine you wake up one morning to discover you've been transplanted into someone else's body. Your memories, personality, and sense of self are intact, but your physical form is entirely different. Meanwhile, your original body is now inhabited by someone else's mind. The question is, which body is you? Is it the one you currently inhabit, or the one that used to house your mind? It asks whether our sense of self is tied more closely to our mind, our thoughts, memories, and consciousness, or to our physical body. If you believe your identity is primarily mental, then you'd say you are whenever your mind resides. But if you feel your identity is inseparable from your physical form, you might argue that you remain in your original body, no matter who inhabits it. If someone else with entirely different memories and thoughts occupies your body, is that person you in any meaningful sense? Also, if your mind is in a new body, how much of your old self is preserved? Gavagai problem. Imagine a linguist trying to translate a completely unfamiliar language spoken by a remote tribe. One day, the linguist observes a tribesperson pointing out a rabbit and saying the word gavagai. The linguist might initially assume that gavagai means rabbit, but other interpretations are equally plausible. It can mean furry creature, food, part of a rabbit, like its ear, or even undetached rabbit part, depending on the linguistic and cultural framework of the tribe. No matter of observational evidence can definitely determine the exact meaning of gavagai. This is because translation depends not only on external behavior, but also on underlying conceptual frameworks, which might differ significantly between the linguist and the tribe. For instance, while the linguist might assume a one-to-one mapping between words and objects, the tribe's language might operate on entirely different principles of categorization and reference. As a result, the meaning of Gavagai remains indeterminate without shared linguist and conceptual conventions. Squirrel. Imagine a man standing on one side of a tree and a squirrel on another. The man tries to walk around the tree to get a good look at the squirrel, but the squirrel moves in sync, always keeping the tree between itself and the man. So the question is, does the man go around the squirrel? Whether the man goes around the squirrel depends on how the terms are defined. If going around means moving in a circular path relative to the tree, then the man does indeed go around the squirrel. However, if going around means getting to all sides of the squirrel, front, back, left, and right, then he is not. Both answers are correct depending on the perspective taken. Talking with God. Imagine you're having a conversation with God. You ask, "What is good?" God replies, "Good is what I command." At first, this seems straightforward. Goodness is defined by whatever God decrees, but then you begin to wonder, is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? If something is good simply because God commands it, then morality appears to be arbitrary. God could command anything, even the acts we consider bad, and it will become good. On the other hand, if God commands something because it is inherently good, then morality exists independently of God, suggesting there's a standard of good that even God must follow. Both options raise issues. If morality depends solely on God's will, it seems to lack objective grounding. What stops God from changing the moral rules tomorrow? Also, if morality exists outside of God's commands, it undermines the idea of God as the ultimate source of moral authority, leaving the question, what determines this independent standard of goodness? Twin Earth. Imagine Earth and a hypothetical twin Earth, identical in almost every way. On twin Earth, people speak a language identical to English, and their world looks just like ours. However, there's one crucial difference. What they call water is not H2O, but a chemically distinct substance, XYZ. To twin Earth inhabitants, water refers to XYZ, while on Earth, water refers to H2O. Despite being visually and functionally similar, the two substances are chemically different. While someone on Earth in 1750 used the word water, did it mean the same thing as when someone on twin Earth used their identical term? The thought experiment shows that meaning is not determined solely by what is in the speaker's mind. Instead, it depends on external factors, specifically the nature of the substances the word refers to. This is known as semantic externalism, the idea that the meaning of a term is partly determined by its relation to the external world. Even if an earthling and twin earthling are identical in their mental states, their words water refer to different things due to substances' distinct chemical compositions. This means that meaning is not just about internal understandings, but also about the environment and context in which the term is used. Wittgenstein's S. Imagine a scenario where someone uses the symbol S to denote a private sensation, like a particular kind of pain or feeling. Each time they experience the sensation, they record it in a diary with S. The question is, can this system of notion genuinely count as a language? It is argued that it cannot. For a language to function, there must be a criteria for correctness, rules that allow others to verify whether a term is used properly. In the case of S, there is no external standard to determine if the symbol is being used consistently or correctly. The person can only rely on their memory of the sensation, which, if pointed out, is fallible and subjective. Without an independent method of verification, the symbol S has no meaningful application. Wittgenstein's games. Consider the term game and attempt to define it. Games include activities like board games, card games, sports, and childhood play. At first, one might try to find a common feature, such as competition, but not all games involve competing. Think of solitary games like playing a jigsaw puzzle. Alternatively, one might suggest fun or entertainment, but not all games are fun. Some professional sports can be grueling. There's no single defining feature shared by all games. Instead, it introduces the concept of family resemblance, just as members of a family might share overlapping traits. Eye color, facial color, or mannerisms. Different games share overlapping similarities without having a single common essence. For example, chess and soccer are both competitive, while chess and solitaire are both structured by rules. These overlaps create a network of relationships rather than rigid definition. That the meaning of a word is determined by how it's used in its context, rather than strict definitions. This emphasizes the fluid and practical nature of challenge. It challenges the expectation that all concepts can be neatly defined. Instead, many concepts have flexible and overlapping boundaries. Robinson Crusoe. Imagine Robinson Crusoe, stranded alone on an island, inventing and using a private language to describe his experiences. For example, he might assign unique symbols or sounds to represent different events, objects, or sensations. The question is, can such a language, intelligible only to Crusoe, truly function as a language? Crusoe's symbols and notations could still have meaning, provided they are systematically connected to his experiences. For example, if Crusoe consistently associates a particular symbol with the sight of a palm tree, the symbol could be considered meaningful because it reflects a stable relationship between his mental states and external reality. Can language exist independently of social context, or is it inherently tied to communal use and validation? Epistemology, which is essentially just the study of knowledge. A priori space. This argues that space is not something we learn from experience, nor is it a property of the external world itself. Instead, space is a framework imposed by the mind and a priori form of intuition that structures how we perceive and understand the external world. Consider how we perceive objects in space. When we observe the relationships between objects like their positions, distances, or arrangements, these spatial characteristics do not exist independently of our perception. Instead, the mind organizes sensory data into spatial forms, making space an inherent condition of human perception rather than an external property of reality. This means that space is a priori. It precedes experience and necessary for information to occur. We do not learn the concept of space through observation. Instead, it is a precondition that allows us to perceive objects as existing outside and beside one another. Blind man. Imagine a man born blind who has learned to distinguish a sphere and a cube by touch alone. He knows their shapes through tactile perception, but has never seen them. One day, he gains the ability to see. So the question is, upon seeing the sphere and the cube for the first time, without touching them, would he be able to visually identify which is which based on his prior tactile knowledge? The man would not be able to identify the objects by sight alone. It's argued that the visual and tactile perceptions are distinct, and the blind man would need to learn how the visual properties of objects, such as the edges and curvature, correspond to their tactile properties through experience. This challenges the idea that knowledge is innate or purely intellectual. Instead, it suggests that sensory knowledge is learned and that associations between different senses are constructed through experience. This supports the broader empiricist view that all knowledge originates in sensory experience. Chaotic world. In this chaotic world, there are no consistent patterns, laws of nature, or predictable sequences. For example, the sun might rise one day, but fail to rise the next, or objects might fall upward instead of downward without any discernible reason. In such a world, there would be no basis for expecting the future to resemble the past, and all attempts to predict events would be futile. Induction relies on observing patterns in past experiences, assuming they hold true in the future. In a chaotic world where events are entirely random, this assumption would be impossible and inductive reasoning would collapse. While we cannot directly prove that nature is uniform, the consistent success of inductive reasoning in our world gives us a good reason to trust it. The trust is pragmatic. We use regularly because it works, even though it cannot be logically guaranteed. Clairvoyance. Imagine Norman, an ordinary person who has inexplicable clairvoyant ability to know certain facts without evidence or reason. For example, Norman forms the belief that the president is in New York City, and by sheer coincidence, this belief is true. Norman has no evidence to support this belief and no reason to trust his clairvoyant powers. He's unaware that he even possesses them. So does Norman know that the president is in New York City? According to reliabilist theories of knowledge, which holds that beliefs formed through reliable processes, count as knowledge. Norman's belief should qualify as knowledge. His clairvoyant ability is reliable and consistently leads to true beliefs. However, intuitively, it feels incorrect to say that Norman knows this fact because his belief lacks justification in traditional sense. He has no evidence, reasons, or understanding of why his belief is true. Reliable belief forming processes may lead to true beliefs, but without justification or awareness, such beliefs don't seem to qualify as knowledge. Constant conjunction. This observes that when we say one event causes another, such as striking a match to cause a light, that we actually perceive is not causation itself, but a consistent pattern. The striking is always followed by the lighting. This repeated association of events is what's called constant conjunction. Our belief in causation arises not from observing any necessary connection between events, but from the mind's habit to associating them after repeating experience. For example, when we repeatedly see a billiard ball strike another and observe the second ball move, we infer a causal relationship. However, what we perceive are two separate events, impact and movement, not the connection itself. The idea of a necessary connection between the cause and effect exists only in the mind, not in the external world. Elementary, my dear Watson. Imagine you're handed 4 cards. Each card has a letter on one side and a number on the other. They're laid out in front of you, A, D, 3, and 7. You're given a simple rule. If a card has a vowel on one side, it must have an even number on the other. Your task is to test whether the rule is true by flipping over as few cards as possible. Which cards do you choose? Many people instinctively pick up A to check if there's an even number on the back, and 3 to see if there's a vowel behind it. However, this isn't the correct approach. The key is to test not what confirms the rule, but also what could disprove it. To properly evaluate the rule, you need to flip over A and 7. Here's why. Flipping A checks if there's an even number behind the vowel, directly testing the rule. Flipping 7 checks if there's a vowel behind an odd number, which would disprove the rule. D and 3 don't matter because they can't provide information that confirms or refutes the rule. A constant for an even number isn't relevant to the specific claim. This task is known as the Watson selection task, a classic test of reasoning that demonstrates how people often seek confirmation rather than falsification. Humans tend to look for evidence that supports a rule rather than trying to disprove it, a bias known as confirmation bias. This can lead to a flawed reasoning, as real-world problems often require testing for exceptions, not examples. Epistemically inflexible climber. Imagine a climber hanging precariously from a sheer cliff face, their life dependent on the strength of the rope holding them. Despite all the evidence suggesting that the rope is fraying and likely to break, the climber steadily believes it will hold. This belief is not based on rational evaluation of the evidence, but on an intense psychological need to maintain hope or avoid panic. Is it justified? On one hand, the belief is irrational because it contradicts the available evidence. However, from a practical standpoint, the belief serves a crucial purpose, maintaining the climber's composure and focus, which might improve their chances of survival. This introduces a tension between epistemic rationality, forming the beliefs based on evidence, and pragmatic considerations, holding beliefs that are beneficial for survival or mental well-being. Some beliefs might be properly basic or justified independently of evidence, especially when they are shaped by innate faculties or practical needs. The climber's belief, while epistemically unjustified, is an evidentialist sense might still be rational in a broader sense because it aligns with their survival instinct. Equal portions of wood and stone. Imagine 2 physical objects, such as a piece of wood and a piece of stone. They are considered equal in size. Upon closer inspection, however, these objects are not perfectly equal. Small differences in their dimensions or shapes reveal that their equality is approximate, not exact. How do we recognize the concept of perfect equality if no physical objects ever truly embody it? Plato argues that our ability to perceive equality in these objects must come from prior understanding or the abstract form of equality. The forms are eternal, unchanging, and perfect ideals that exist are not observing the perfect equality directly, but are instead recalling or recognizing the form of equality through imperfect approximations in the material world. This goes with the theory of recollection, which holds that our knowledge of the forms originates from a time before birth when the soul had direct contact with the realms of of forms. Our experiences in the physical world triggers memories of these perfect abstract truths. Evil demon. Imagine a powerful and malevolent demon who has the ability to deceive you about everything you experience. This demon could manipulate your senses, creating a completely false reality. For instance, the object you see, the sounds you hear, and even your own body could all be illusions crafted by this demon. So the question is, if such a demon exists, how can you be certain of anything? Even your most basic beliefs about the world. By considering the possibility of an all-encompassing deception, this eliminates any belief based on the senses, and they could be entirely fabricated by the demon. Even mathematical truths, such as 2 plus 2 is 4, could be manipulated by the demon's power. This skepticism leads Descartes to doubt all external reality and focus instead on what cannot be doubted, his own act of thinking. From this he arrives at his famous conclusion, cogito ergo sum, which translates to I think, therefore I am. The certainty of his own existence as a thinking being becomes the foundation for rebuilding knowledge. Fake barns. Imagine a rural area filled with fake barn facades, structures that look exactly like real barns from the outside but are hollow and purely decorative. Unbeknownst to you, you're driving through this area and happen to see one of the few real barns. Based on this observation, you form the belief that's a real barn. Your belief is true because the barn you saw is real, and it's simply justified because it is based on reliable process of visual perception. However, intuitively, it doesn't feel like you genuinely know that it's a barn. The reason that it's your belief's true hinges on luck. You just happen to look at one of the real barns in a region dominated by fakes. If you had looked at any of the fake barns, you would have formed a false belief. While your belief meets these criteria, its justification is undermined by the deceptive environment. Knowledge requires more than justification and truth. It must also be immune to certain kinds of epistemic luck. False report. Imagine a newspaper publishes a false report claiming a local politician has resigned. Based on this report, you form the belief that the politician has resigned. Unbeknownst to you, the politician had actually decided to resign before the false report was published, but the newspaper stories was entirely coincidental and not based on the actual decision. In this scenario, your belief that the politician resigned is both true and justified. True because the resignation genuinely occurred, and justified because you relied on what appeared to be a credible source, the newspaper. However, your belief was not formed in a reliable way, as it was based on a false report rather than the actual resignation event. Intuitively, it seems incorrect to say that you knew the politician had resigned, as the truth of your being was coincidental rather than the result of reliable reasoning. Justified true belief is insufficient for knowledge, as it fails to account for the role of epistemic luck. The truth of belief, in this case, does not depend on justification that led to it, creating a gap between justification and truth. 5-minute hypothesis. Imagine the entire universe, including Earth, everything on it, and everyone's memories, was created just 5 minutes ago. All evidence of history, fossils, historical records, geological formations, was fabricated in that instant, and all your memories of events prior to the 5 minutes ago were implanted at the moment of creation. Despite appearances, there will be no genuine past beyond those 5 minutes. How can we know that the universe wasn't created in this way? Since all evidence of the past could be fabricated and indistinguishable from real evidence, there's no empirical way to disprove the hypothesis. It highlights the inherent limitations of relying on memory and physical evidence as proof of the past. It forces us to confront the assumptions we make about reality and how justify beliefs about the past. If the 5-minute hypothesis cannot be disproven, what does this say about the certainty of our knowledge? Mission shade of blue. Imagine a person who has experienced every shade of blue except for one. It presented with a spectrum of blue shades laid out from light to dark, with the missing shade left behind. Could this person form an idea of the missing shade without directly experiencing it? The person might indeed be able to imagine the missing shade by interpolating between the shades they have seen. This suggests that it is possible in rare cases to form an idea without corresponding sensory impression. The mind has a capacity for creative synthesis, filling gaps in sensory experience. If the missing shade can be imagined, this implies that the mind is not merely a passive recipient of impressions, but also an active processor capable of creating new ideas from known ones. Mr. Truetemp. Imagine Mr. Truetemp, an ordinary person, unbeknownst to him, has highly reliable temperature-sensing device implanted in his brain. This device allows him to accurately know the temperature at any moment, without relying on external thermometers or sensory perception. For example, Mr. Truetemp might spontaneously believe it is 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and he would always be correct. However, Mr. Truetemp has no idea that he possesses this device, nor does he have any reason to trust his temperature-related beliefs. From his perspective, these beliefs arise without explanation or evidence, almost like random thoughts. Can Mr. Truetemp's temperature beliefs be considered knowledge? Mr. Truetemp's beliefs might qualify as knowledge because they are produced by a reliable process. However, Mr. Truetemp's beliefs do not feel like genuine knowledge because they lack justification in the traditional sense. Since Mr. Truetemp is unaware of the source of his beliefs and has no evidence for their accuracy, his beliefs seem accidental or ungrounded from his perspective. Pascal's mugging. Imagine you're walking down the street and a stranger stops you. They claim to have the power to control the fabric of reality and demand $5. If you refuse, they threaten to unleash a catastrophic suffering across infinite dimensions. If you comply, they promise to create unimaginable joy for countless beings forever. The odds of their claim being true seem astronomically low, but the stakes are indefinitely high. Should you give them the money? This is Pascal's mugging, a thought experiment named after Blaise Pascal's famous Pascal's wager. While Pascal's wager argues that believing in God is a rational bet because the potential award, eternal bliss, vastly outweighs the cost, Pascal's mugging exposes a potential flaw in his reasoning. It highlights how decision-making based on expected utility can break down when faced with scenarios involving extremely small probabilities and extraordinarily large outcomes. In the mugging, the expected utility of giving $5 might seem compelling, even if the chance that the stranger is telling the truth is minuscule. The infinite reward they promise would, in theory, make the decision worthwhile. However, this logic opens the door to absurdities. If someone can claim wildly improbable but infinitely impactful scenario, why should you ever refuse? Pyromaniac. Imagine a pyromaniac who is convinced without any solid evidence that the conditions are perfect for a fire to break out in a forest. A dry summer, high winds, and no recent rainfall. His belief is purely speculative, based more on his desires and imagination than on reliable data. As it happens, shortly after forming this belief, a fire does indeed break out in the forest. However, the cause of the fire is not reliable to the factors the pyromaniac imagined, such as dry conditions or wind. Instead, it is due to a lightning strike, an event he did not predict or consider. Despite the truth of his belief that a fire would occur, his reasoning for it is entirely unfounded and coincidental. Can the pyromaniac be said to know that a fire would occur? Intuitively, the answer seems to be no, because his belief, while true, lacked proper justification and was not formed through a reliable or rational process. Russell's teapot. Imagine someone claims that a small teapot is orbiting the sun somewhere between Earth and Mars. It's too small to be detected by any telescope, but the claim insists the teapot exists. You understandably doubt this, but the claimant argues that since you can't prove the teapot doesn't exist, you should accept their belief. Should you? The burden of proof lies on the person making a claim, not on others to disprove it. In this case, it's unreasonable to demand others to disprove the existence of the teapot, just as it would be unreasonable to expect someone to disprove any arbitrary and unfalsifiable claim. The teapot argument challenges the idea that belief in something is justified merely because it hasn't been disproven. The inability to disprove a claim doesn't make it true or worthy of belief. Extraordinary claims such as an orbiting teapot or a divine being require extraordinary evidence. Without such evidence, the rational position is to withhold belief, even if the claim cannot be definitely proven. Smith and Jones. Is justified true belief knowledge? According to its definition, a person knows something if three conditions are met. They believe it, it is true, and they have justification for believing it. This demonstrates that these conditions are not sufficient by constructing scenarios where all three conditions are met, yet the result does not seem to qualify as genuine knowledge. In this case, Smith and Jones are job applicants. Smith has strong evidence for the following proposition. Jones will get the job, and Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. Smith's evidence might include the employer's statement that Jones will be hired and his observation that Jones has 10 coins. From this, Smith concludes that the derived proposition, the person who will get the job has 10 coins in their pocket. However, it turns out that Smith, not Jones, is hired, and unbeknownst to him, Smith also has 10 coins in his pocket. Thus, the proposition, the person who will get the job has 10 coins in their pocket, is true. But Smith's justification for believing it is based on a false premise about Jones. While Smith's belief is true and justified, it seems incorrect to say that Smith knew this proposition, as his reasoning was flawed. The veil of ignorance. Imagine a group of individuals tasked with designing the basic structure of society, its laws, institutions, and distribution of resources. However, these individuals are behind a veil of ignorance. They know nothing about their own place in this society, their gender, race, wealth, talents, religion, or even values. The veil of ignorance ensures that no one can design society to favor their own particular circumstances. Since no one knows whether they will be rich or poor, advantaged or disadvantaged, the decisions they make must protect everyone equally. The goal is to determine what rules rational individuals will agree to, and if they had no knowledge of their personal circumstances, thereby ensuring fairness. People in the original position would choose two key principles of justice, the liberty principle and the difference principle. People would avoid creating laws that privilege one group over another, since they wouldn't know whether they might end up a disadvantaged group. Similarly, they would favor systems that protect the worst off as precaution against ending up in the same position themselves. Wax. Consider a piece of solid wax, freshly taken from a honeycomb. Using the senses, we observe its properties. It has a distinct shape, texture, color, smell, and makes a certain sound when tapped. However, when the wax is brought near a flame, its sensory properties change. It melts into a liquid, losing its original shape, texture, and sound. The smell and color may also alter. Despite these changes, we still recognize the melted wax as the same piece of wax. How do we know that the wax remains the same object when all of its sensory properties have changed? Our recognition of the wax's essence, its extension in space, its ability to change shape, and its capacity to occupy physical space is not based on sensory input alone. Instead, it requires the activity of the mind. The senses provide raw data about the wax's changing states, but it is intellect or reason that allows us to grasp the wax's underlying unchanging nature as a material substance. Logic. $1 million puzzle. Imagine you're presented with two boxes. Box A, which is transparent and contains $1,000, and Box B, which is opaque and may either contain $1 million or nothing. You face a choice. Take only Box B or take both Box A and Box B. However, there's a twist. Before you make your decision, a highly accurate predictor has already made a prediction about what you'll do. The predictor, known for a near-perfect accuracy, works like this. If it predicts you will only take Box B, it has placed $1 million in it. If it predicts that you take both boxes, it has left Box B empty. By the time you make your choice, the contents of the boxes are fixed, and the predictor cannot change its decision. If you follow dominant reasoning, you reason that no matter what the predictor has done, you're always better off taking both boxes. After all, Box A has $1,000 guaranteed, and taking both boxes doesn't affect the contents of Box B. If Box B is empty, you'll get $1,000 instead of nothing, and if it contains $1 million, you get $1 million and $1,000 instead of just $1 million. But if you follow expected utility reasoning, you might decide to take only Box B. But why? Because the predictor's accuracy means that your choice correlates strongly with the contents of Box B. People who only take Box B almost always end up with $1 million, while those who take both boxes usually end up with just $1,000. From this perspective, trusting the predictor and taking only Box B maximizes your expected payoff. Is your choice truly free if the predictor can reliably foresee it? Does the predictor's accuracy mean that your future decision is already determined? Barber paradox. Imagine a barber in a village who's defined as the person who shaves all of those and only those who do not shave themselves. The question is, does the barber shave himself? If the barber shaves himself, then according to the definition, he should not shave himself, as he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. However, if he does not shave himself, then he must shave himself, because he shaves all of those who do not shave themselves. This creates a logical contradiction. The barber cannot consistently either shave or not shave himself. There is a similar problem with the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. If such a set exists, then it must both contain itself, because it does not contain itself, and not contain itself because it only includes sets that do not contain themselves, leading to a contradiction. Coherence. This is a situation where inconsistent probabilities lead to guaranteed losses, which connects rationality and probability assignments to avoiding exploitable betting scenarios. So suppose you're setting odds or probabilities for uncertain events. If your probabilities are inconsistent or fail to obey basic rules of probability, such as adding up to 1 for mutual exclusive outcomes, a clever bettor could construct a series of bets that guarantees you lose money, no matter the outcome. This guaranteed loss is what's called the Dutch book. For example, imagine you assign probabilities of 0.6 to an event, say rain tomorrow, and 0.5 to its complement of no rain. Since these add up to more than 1, a bettor could bet against you on both outcomes in such a way that they win money regardless of whether it rains or not. The inconsistency of your probabilities create an exploitable loophole, showing that if a person's probability assignments are not coherent, meaning they don't follow the axioms of probability, they are vulnerable to a Dutch book. So if their probabilities are coherent, no Dutch book can be made against them. Coherence is tied to updating beliefs in a consistent way based on new evidence. If you fail to do so, your beliefs can become exploitable, not necessarily in the literal gambling sense, but in terms of logical inconsistency on poor decision making. Grew. Imagine a predicate grew, which applies to objects that are green if observed before a certain time. Example, January 1st, 2050, and blue if observed afterward. For example, an emerald examined today is grew because it is green, and the observation occurs before 2050. However, after 2050, an emerald would only be grew if it appears blue. Why do we assume that green is not a valid basis for induction about emeralds, while grew is not? Both predicates are equally consistent with past observations. We've only seen green emeralds, which supports both the claim all emeralds are green and the claim all emeralds are grew, yet we intuitively favor green as the basis for predicting future emerald appearances. There's a problem with predictability. Why certain predicates like green are considered more appropriate for performing generalizations than others like grew. This leads to a new riddle of induction, which asks not just how we justify induction, but how we distinguish between valid and invalid generalizations. Hilbert's Hotel. Imagine a grand hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all fully occupied. You arrive at the front desk, asking for a room. At first glance, this seems impossible. Every room is already taken, but in this hotel, infinity works differently. The manager cheerfully explains that they can accommodate you by moving the guests in room 1 to room 2, and the guests from room 2 and room 3, and so on. This process frees up room 1 for you, even though the hotel is full. Even if all positions are filled, it's still possible to make room for more without displacing anyone permanently. Now, imagine a bus with an infinite number of new guests arrive. The manager solves this by shifting every current guest to a room double their current number. Room 1 goes to room 2, room 2 goes to room 4, and so on, leaving all the odd number rooms vacant. This creates infinite space for the new arrivals, demonstrating that an infinite set can expand to accommodate others' infinite set. If infinitely many buses with infinitely many passengers each arrive, the manager can still accommodate everyone by employing a more complex reorganization. This shows that infinity isn't like finite numbers. It behaves in ways that defy everyday intuition. Infinity isn't a fixed quantity, but a concept with its own strange rules. For example, while adding or subtracting finite numbers changes the total, adding or removing elements from an infinite set often leaves the set unchanged. Other thinking beings. Imagine a scenario where other beings vastly different from humans possess their own system of thought. These beings might communicate and reason in ways entirely alien to us, using concepts and structures that do not align with our own. The question that's raised is whether their thoughts can be considered objective and whether we could ever truly understand them. For thought to be meaningful and communicable, it must exist in a shared objective realm independent of any particular mind. This is central to the theory of third realm, a domain of abstract objective entities like numbers, propositions, and logical truths that are accessible to all rational beings. Thoughts, in this sense, are not private mental occurrences, but objective contents that exist independently of the individual who think them. For example, the Pythagorean theorem is true regardless of whether humans or other beings understand it. Surprise quiz. Imagine a teacher announces to a class on Friday there will be a quiz next week, but you won't know the day of the quiz until it happens. It will be a surprise. The students begin to reason through their announcement, attempting to deduce when the quiz can occur. They start by eliminating Friday. If the quiz hasn't occurred by Thursday night, it must be on Friday, making it no longer a surprise. Therefore, Friday can be ruled out. Next, they eliminate Thursday. If the quiz cannot happen on Friday, it hasn't occurred on Wednesday night, then it must be on Thursday, which would also fail to be a surprise. Using similar logic, the students eliminate each day of the week, concluding that a surprise quiz is impossible. However, the teacher gives the quiz on, say, Wednesday, and the students are genuinely surprised. This creates a paradox. The student's reasoning appears logically sound, but the quiz still meets the condition of being unexpected. Attempting to anticipate an event can undermine the conditions for that event's occurrence. The Monty Hall problem. Imagine you're a contestant on the game show. Before you are 3 doors. Behind one is a shiny new car, and behind the other are 2 goats. Your goal is to win the car. You pick a door, say door 1. The host, who knows what's behind all the doors, then opens another door, say door 3, to reveal a goat. Now you're faced with a choice. Stick to door 1 or switch to door 2. Now what should you do? It seems like it doesn't matter whether you switch or stay. After all, 2 doors remain, so it feels like there's a 50-50 chance of winning the car. But this intuition is wrong. Statistically, you should always switch. Here's why. When you first choose door 1, there's a 1/3 chance that the car is behind it, and a 2/3 chance that the car is behind one of the other 2 doors. When Monty opened doors 3 to reveal a goat, he doesn't change the initial probabilities. Instead, he's giving you additional information. The 2/3 probability that the car was behind one of the other doors is now concentrated entirely on door 2 because door 3 has been eliminated. The key lies in understanding how Monty's actions, always opening a door with a goat, affects the probabilities. 2 spheres. Imagine a possible world containing only 2 identical spheres, perfectly alike in every way, the same size, mass, and material composition. These spheres are not distinguished by any external relations, such as their distance from other objects, because no other object exists in this world. The question arises, how can the 2 spheres be individuated? What makes one sphere distinct from the other? The 2 spheres share all intrinsic properties, and there are no external relations to appeal to. Since the world consists only of these 2 spheres, thus, the principle states that if 2 entities are indistinguishable in all their properties, they must be identical. Effectively the same entity, the 2 spheres, however, appear to violate this principle. They are distinct entities, despite being indistinguishable in every measurable way. Earn a red ball. Imagine a room containing a large urn filled with balls. Some of the balls are red and the rest are white. You know the total number of balls, but you don't know how many are of each color. Your task is to determine the proportion of red balls in the urn, but here's the catch. You can only draw balls randomly, one at a time, and observe their colors. As you draw balls, patterns begin to emerge. For instance, if your first 10 balls yield mostly red balls, you might reasonably conclude the urn contains a highly proportion of red balls. But how confident should you be in this conclusion? What if the next few draws contradict your initial observation? Your initial belief about the proportion of red balls, your prior probability, should combine with the evidence from your draws to form a revised belief or posterior probability. The more balls you draw, the more reliable your estimate becomes. However, uncertainty never entirely disappears unless you inspect the urn's contents directly. Even if every ball you've drawn so far is red, there's always a chance that future draws will produce white balls. This challenges the reliability of predictions in situations where complete information is unavailable. Valid or invalid. Imagine you're presented with a series of arguments, each consisting of premises and a conclusion. Your task is simple. Determine whether the argument is valid or invalid. Validity in this context doesn't mean the argument is true, but rather that its conclusion logically follows from its premises. In a valid argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. An invalid argument, by contrast, allows for the possibility that the premises are true, yet the conclusion is false. Consider this example. All cats are mammals. Felix is a cat. Therefore, Felix is a mammal. This argument is valid because the conclusion necessarily follows the premises. Now imagine, all cats are mammals. Felix is a mammal. Therefore, Felix is a cat. This argument is invalid. While the premises are true, the conclusion doesn't logically follow. It's possible Felix is a dog or other type of animal. Ethics. Automatic reversible contraception. Imagine a world where every person is automatically fitted at birth with a reversible contraceptive device. This device ensures that no one can conceive a child unless they explicitly choose to deactivate it. Deactivation is straightforward but requires active intent and effort, such as consulting a medical professional. On one hand, such a system could address issues like overpopulation, unplanned pregnancies, and resource scarcity, contributing to a more sustainable society. By preventing unintentional conceptions, it could also reduce the number of abortions and improve the quality of life for families, as well as every child would be born into circumstances where they are actively wanted. But on the other hand, is it ethical to impose contraception universally, even if it's reversible? Some might argue that making reproduction an opt-in process infringes on personal freedoms, even if the system is designed with good intentions. Additionally, there is a risk of such technology being misused by authoritarian regimes to enforce oppressive population policies. The chainsaw. Imagine a person chopping wood in the forest with a chainsaw. While they are aware that the forest is sometimes visited by hikers, they believe it is unlikely that anyone is nearby. Without checking their surroundings, they begin cutting trees. Unbeknownst to them, a hiker is resting just behind one of the trees, and the hiker is fatally injured by the chainsaw. The chainsaw user did not intend to harm anyone, but their failure to take precautions, such as checking the area before starting, raises the question of their moral responsibility. Should they be held accountable for the hiker's death, even though it was accidental? Or does the low probability of hikers being present lessen their culpability? While the harm was unintended, the failure to take reasonable steps to avoid it, such as verifying that no one was nearby, might still make the chainsaw user morally blameworthy. Deluded sadist. This thought experiment involves a sadist who believes they are inflicting severe pain on another person, but in reality, they are deluded. The person they are torturing is not actually in pain, and the torture is harmless. The sadist's beliefs are that their causing harm is based on a complete misunderstanding of the situation, yet the sadist's experience of pleasure from the imagined pain is still intense. The sadist believes they are causing genuine suffering, and their pleasure is tied to this belief. However, from an objective standpoint, no pain exists in the person being tortured. There is only the sadist's misguided perception of it. While the sadist's feelings of pleasure are real, they are based on false beliefs, and the experience of pain does not exist in objective terms. Egoist. Imagine a person who adopts egoism as their guiding principle, refusing to help others or acknowledge any obligation unless it directly benefits them. For example, this person might never help a friend in need, share resources, or act kindly unless they expect something in return. The thought experiment challenges whether such a lifestyle is sustainable and whether it aligns with human nature and societal norms. Egoism faces practical problems. If everyone acted purely out of self-interest, the trust and cooperation necessary for society to function would erode. Relationships would be transactional, and the egoists would likely find themselves isolated, unable to rely on others in times of need. As well, this questions whether the egoist can even experience genuine happiness or satisfaction. A life without compassion or connection may be emotionally hollow, undermining the egoist's pursuit of personal well-being. Can someone truly be an egoist without contradictions? For example, if an egoist values relationships or seeks love and admiration, they are implicitly relying on the goodwill of others, something egoism does not account for. Extreme self-interest may ultimately conflict with the social and emotional needs that make life meaningful. Equium. Imagine a world where species of non-human animals called equium exists. Equium are biologically similar to humans in many key ways, including their cognitive abilities, emotional complexity, and capacity for suffering. They can communicate with humans through language and participate in social activities. However, they are not considered part of the human species, despite their similarities to humans. Equium are used for labor, experimentation, and food production, much like how humans treat other animals in our current world. If humans were to treat Equium as inferior despite their human-like traits, it would highlight the inconsistency in our moral reasoning. For example, we might argue that intelligence, communication, or social bonds justify moral consideration, but in the case of Equium, these traits are ignored due to the non-human status. If we accept that Equium deserves rights and protections because of their human-like qualities, why would we deny similar rights to other non-human animals with comparable capacities for suffering and well-being? Experience machine. Imagine a futuristic machine that can simulate any experience you desire. Once connected, you won't know you're in the machine. Instead, you'll believe you're living a perfect life, filled with all the pleasure and achievements you could ever dream of. You could program your ideal life in advance and spend the rest of your days blissfully unaware that it's all an illusion. Would you choose to plug into this machine for the rest of your life? Many people instinctively reject the idea, despite the promise of perfect happiness, that there is more to life than just experiencing pleasure. Humans value authenticity, reality, and personal agency. We want to do meaningful things, not just feel as if we are doing them. Is it enough to feel good, or do we need our experiences to be grounded in reality? It challenges hedonistic philosophies by arguing that we care about more than just pleasure. We care about living a genuine life, making authentic connections, and being active participants in the world. Fenelon. This centers around a fictional account of an ideal ruler, Fenelon, who governs a nation with perfect wisdom, justice, and benevolence. Fenelon is portrayed as a ruler who rules solely by reason and virtue, without relying on force or coercion. In the imagined society under Fenelon's rule, the leader does not impose laws through punishment or fear, but instead uses reason and virtue to guide people. This ideal form of governance presents a contrast to the usual political realities, where leaders often maintain power through force, manipulation, or coercion. In this society, humans are assumed to be naturally capable and of reason and moral judgment, and when governed by a truly just ruler like Fenelon, they will make decisions based on wisdom, cooperation, and mutual respect other than fear and violence. Fenelon's examples suggest that if individuals are properly educated and nurtured, they can be guided to act justly without the need for oppressive laws or enforcement mechanisms. Framing the epidemic. Imagine you're the leader of a country facing a deadly epidemic. You must choose between two programs to combat the disease, each with identical outcomes but framed differently. In one scenario, Program A guarantees that 200 lives will be saved. Program B offers a 33% chance of saving everyone, but a 67% chance that no one will be saved. Most people choose Program A. It feels safer and more certain. Now, consider the same situation framed like this. Program C ensures that 400 people will die, while Program D offers a 33% chance that no one will die and a 67% chance that everyone will die. Faced with these options, most people prefer Program D, even though it's mathematically identical to Program B. The outcomes in the scenarios are identical, 200 people live or 400 people die, but framing the choices as saving lives versus causing deaths shifts our preferences. While framed positively, people tend to avoid risk, while framed negatively, they become risk-seeking. Our judgments aren't always based purely on logic or data. Instead, they're shaped by emotional and psychological factors, such as the aversion to losses. The framing effect demonstrates loss aversion, where the pain of losing something feels stronger than the joy of gaining the equivalent. Politicians, advertisers, and media often uses framing to influence public opinion. For example, presenting an unemployment rate as 90% employment feels more optimistic than 10% unemployment, even though both describe the same situation. Similarly, a medical treatment described as 90% effective feels more reassuring than one with a 10% failure rate. Gas. In this thought experiment, a person has control over a gas that can cause harm to others, but only if they choose to release it. The gas is lethal, and if it's released, it will kill a group of people nearby. The question is whether it is morally permissible for the person to release the gas. In the case of the gas, the person may have the option by allowing the harm to occur by not releasing the gas, or doing the harm by actively releasing it. The moral dilemma hinges on whether the person is more responsible for actively causing harm or for failing to prevent harm by not intervening. A strict act utilitarian might argue that if the greater good, such as the well-being of a larger group, can be achieved by releasing the gas, it would be morally permissible, even though it causes harm to others. On the other hand, deontological approaches, which emphasize duties and rules, might argue that releasing the gas is inherently wrong, regardless of the consequences. Growing child in a tiny house. Imagine a tiny house with rapidly growing child inside. The child continues to grow, and it becomes clear that if the growth doesn't stop, the child will crush you to death. The child does not intend harm, it is simply growing as a natural process. However, if nothing is done, your life will end. The scenario is meant to parallel pregnancy, where continuing to term would threaten the life of the pregnant person. While the child's growth isn't malicious, the person in the house, which represents the pregnant individual, has the right to defend their lives. This includes taking action to stop the child from growing, even if it results in the child's death. Self-defense can be morally permissible, even when harm to others is unintentional or unavoidable. Hedonine and pononine. Imagine two chemical substances, hedonine, which induces intense feelings of happiness and pleasure in whoever consumes it, and pononine, which enhances empathy and sense of moral duty towards others. Both chemicals are available to people, but each leads to different societal consequences. If everyone chooses hedonine, society becomes focused solely on individual pleasure, potentially neglecting social bonds, responsibilities, and long-term well-being. On the other hand, if everyone opts for pononine, society might prioritize collective welfare, even at the expense of individual happiness. If widespread use of hedonine leads to societal dysfunction, such as the neglect of vulnerable or environmental degradation, does this suggest that individual pleasure cannot be the sole measure of ethical behavior? On the other hand, pononine's emphasis on moral duty invites reflection on whether prioritizing responsibility over personal happiness creates a meaningful or fulfilling life. Is it ethical to sacrifice personal pleasure entirely for the sake of collective welfare? Jim in South America. Jim, a botanist, stumbles upon a small South American village where 20 innocent villagers are tied up and set to be executed by a group of soldiers. The captain recognizes Jim as a distinguished visitor, offers him a horrifying choice. If Jim personally kills one of the villagers, the remaining 19 will be set free. If he refuses, the soldiers will execute all 20. The villagers, aware of the situation, plead for Jim to accept the offer, knowing it means saving most of their lives. On one hand, from a utilitarian perspective, Jim should kill one villager to minimize overall harm, sacrificing one life to save 19. But on the other hand, this choice forces Jim to personally take a life, which raises questions about individual moral responsibility. Is Jim more responsible for an act he commits directly or for the consequences of his inaction? The kitten. Imagine you're presented with a kitten and a serum that, if injected, would cause the kitten to develop human-level intelligence and consciousness. Without the serum, the kitten remains a non-person. Now, consider whether it will be morally permissible to painlessly kill the kitten before or after administering the serum. Moral significance should be tied to the actual characteristics of a being, such as consciousness or self-awareness, rather than its potential to develop those traits. If we argue that it is acceptable to kill the kitten before it becomes a person, it challenges the idea that potential personhood confers moral rights. Last people. Imagine a scenario in which the human species is on the verge of extinction. A group of last surviving humans has the capability to destroy the natural environment entirely, obliterating all plants, animals, and ecosystems before they too perish. They do this not out of necessity, but simply because they can. Would it be morally permissible for the last people to annihilate the natural world? The answer seems intuitively to be to no, but this response raises deeper philosophical issues. If there are no humans left to value or benefit from nature, why does it matter if the natural world is destroyed? Lifeboat. Imagine a lifeboat that can hold only 4 people without sinking. There are 5 individuals aboard, and one must be sacrificed to save the rest. The question is, who should be chosen, and on what moral grounds? Sacrificing the person least likely to contribute to the group's overall well-being, or the one with the least value to society? However, such calculation raises significant ethical concerns about how we value individuals. Are lives equally valuable, or do some lives have more worth based on factors like age, health, or societal contributions? If all lives are equally valuable, then choosing who to sacrifice becomes morally arbitrary, yet failing to choose results in everyone dying. Nuclear train. Imagine a train carrying a nuclear device traveling through a forest. Due to a malfunction, the train is heading towards a densely populated town where it will explode, killing thousands of people. The only way to prevent this is to divert the train onto a track leading deep into the forest, where the explosion will destroy the forest and its ecosystems, but save the town. Most people would intuitively prioritize saving the town, reflecting the anthropocentric ethics, which place human life above other considerations. However, ecosystems and non-human life forms have intrinsic value too, independent of their utility to humans. Destroying the forest to save the town, they argue, disregards the moral rights of non-human entities and the ecological system that sustain life. People seeds. Imagine a world where people seeds float through the air like pollen. If a seed lands on upholstery in your house, it will take root and grow into a person. To prevent this, you install the best screens on your windows. However, one day, a defective screen allows a seed to get through, and it starts to grow on your couch. This is seen as a comparison to even if precautions are taken to prevent pregnancy, such as using a contraception, a person is not morally obligated to sustain the resulting life that if it occurs despite those efforts. The floating seeds represent conception, and the act of installing screens symbolizes the use of contraception, just as you would not morally require to let the seed grow in your house due to a defect in the screen. It's argued that a person is not obligated to carry pregnancy to term simply because contraception failed. Plank of Carnatus. Imagine you are shipwrecked in the middle of the ocean, clinging to a single wooden plank, which is the only thing keeping you afloat. Suddenly, another survivor swims towards you, also desperate for the plank. The problem? The plank can only support one person. If you let the other survivor take it, you will drown. If you push them away, they will drown. So what will you do? If you push the other person off the plank to save yourself, does necessity excuse what otherwise would be considered murder? It seems like a clear-cut case of survival instinct, but the experiment forces us to examine deeper questions about morality, responsibility, and justice. On one hand, there is the instinctual drive for self-preservation, a force so fundamental that some argue that it absolves moral responsibility. In life or death situations, on the other hand, there is the moral rule that taking another person's life is inherently wrong, regardless of the circumstances. Does necessity suspend morality, or does it reveal its boundaries? Can someone be held accountable for actions taken under extreme circumstances? Ring of Gyges. This tale describes a shepherd, Gyges, who discovers a magical ring that grants him the power of invisibility. With the ring, Gyges can act without fear of being caught or held accountable. He uses this power to seduce the queen, murder the king, and seize the throne, committing these injustices without consequence. So it's asked, if anyone could act without fear of detection, would they still choose to behave justly? Or would they follow Gyges' example and prioritize their own desires? People act justly not just because they value justice itself, but because they fear punishment or societal condemnation. Justice, in this view, is a social contract, a compromise individuals make to protect themselves from harm in a world where others are also constrained by laws and norms. The Ring Digest suggests that without external enforcement, individuals would abandon justice in favor for self-interest. Smith and Jones at the bathtub. Imagine two scenarios. In the first, Smith stands to gain a large inheritance if his 6-year-old cousin dies. One evening, Smith sneaks into the bathroom while the child is bathing and drowns him, making it look like an accident. In the second scenario, Jones also stands to benefit from the death of his 6-year-old cousin. Jones sneaks into the bathroom intending to drown the child, but finds that the child slips, hits his head, and starts drowning in his own. Jones simply watches and lets the child die, doing nothing to save him. Killing is always worse than letting someone die. In both cases, the outcome is the same. The child dies, and both Smith and Jones acted with the same intent, to benefit from the child's death. The only difference is the method. Smith actively caused the death, while Jones passively allowed it to happen. If the intent and consequences are the same, why should one action be considered morally worse than the other? The distinction is often based more on social convention or emotional reaction than on sounding moral reason. The Space Explorer. Imagine a space explorer who is captured by aliens. The aliens plan to use the explorer's body to grow new members of their species by implanting an embryo inside them. Over time, the embryo will develop into a fully intelligent and conscious being, but this process will cause significant hardship and potentially harm the explorer. The explorer, like a pregnant person, has the right to refuse the use of their body, even if it means the embryo will not survive. The explorer's autonomy and control over their body are paramount, and the potential future personhood of the embryo does not override these rights. While the embryo has the potential to become a person, it does not yet possess the characteristics such as consciousness, reasoning, and self-awareness that define moral personhood. Therefore, the rights for the explorer, an actual person, take precedence over the rights of a potential person. The Space Traveler. Imagine a highly intelligent space traveler who lands on an alien planet. The planet is inhabited by beings whose appearance and behavior differ greatly from humans. The traveler must decide whether these beings are persons, entities deserving of moral consideration, or if they can be treated as mere resources like plants or animals. Personhood should not be based on physical appearance or species, but rather on cognitive and physiological traits. It's proposed several criteria from personhood, including consciousness, reasoning, self-motivation, communication, and self-awareness. If the aliens possess these traits, the space traveler should treat them as people with moral rights, regardless of their non-human form. Spelunkers. Imagine a group of spelunkers who are cave explorers trapped in a cave with limited resources and no possibility of rescue for an extended period. As conditions worsen, they face a harrowing choice: to sacrifice one member of the group to provide sustenance for the others, thereby increasing the chances of survival for the majority. A strict utilitarian might argue that the sacrifice is morally permissible or even obligatory, as it maximizes overall well-being by preserving the greatest number of lives. In this view, the act of killing is outweighed by the greater good achieved through the survival of the majority. Survival lottery. Imagine a society where organ transplants are perfected, and there are two patients, A and B, both in need of transplants to survive. A requires a heart, and B requires a liver. Without these organs, both will die. In this society, a survival lottery is proposed, where a random individual, C, who is healthy, will be selected to be killed and their organs harvested to save A and B. So the question is whether such a lottery would be morally justified. From a utilitarian perspective, the survival lottery maximizes overall well-being by saving 2 lives at the cost of 1, potentially making it the most ethical choice. However, the randomness of the lottery eliminates any personal culpability, and the healthy individual C has done nothing to deserve death. Yet the lives of A and B are equally innocent, raising the question of whether Society should prioritize saving the majority over preserving individual rights. If everyone in the society knows they're equally at risk of the lottery, it might seem justifiable. However, it forces individuals to confront the value of their autonomy and their right to life versus the collective good. Terrorist tank. Imagine a soldier is operating an anti-tank missile during wartime. A terrorist commandeers a tank and begins moving towards a civilian area with the intent to kill innocent people. The soldier fires the missile, destroying the tank and stopping the terrorist. However, unknown to the soldier, there are civilians hidden inside the tank who were killed in the process. The soldier's goal was to prevent the terrorists from harming civilians, a morally justified act. Yet the unintended deaths of the civilians inside the tank complicate the moral evaluation. Is the soldier morally responsible for those deaths, even though they were unforeseen and unintended? If there had been no civilians in the tank, the soldier's actions would be universally deemed heroic. However, the presence of the civilians changes the moral perception, even though the soldier's knowledge, intentions, and actions remain the same. The envelope and the vintage sedan. Imagine two scenarios. In the first, you receive an envelope in the mail from a reputable charity. It explains that a donation of $200 could save the life of a child in a distant country by providing clean water, medical care, or essential supplies. You consider the request, but decide not to send any money. Instead, you spend it on something non-essential, like dining out or a new gadget. In the second scenario, you're driving your vintage sedan down a quiet road. Suddenly, you see a child lying injured on the side of the road. Stopping to help would mean abandoning your car, leaving it vulnerable to theft or irreversible damage. Yet most people wouldn't hesitate. They'd rush to help the child, even at the expense of the car's value. Both scenarios involve sacrificing $200, whether as a direct donation or through damage to your property. Yet many find these situations morally distinct. Refusing to donate in the first case feels less wrong than walking away in the second. So why is this? If there is any meaningful difference between the two situations, or are we applying a double standard? In the sedan scenario, the child is physically present and the urgency is immediate, making the moral obligation feel stronger. In contrast, the envelope set scenario feels abstract and the child in need is far away. Their suffering less tangible and the connection between your money and their survival less direct. But does distance truly diminish your moral responsibility? The trolley problem. This is basically the most famous thought experiment there is. In its classic form, you are standing near a trolley track and see a runway trolley heading towards 5 people lining the track. If the trolley continues, all 5 people will be killed. However, you are standing next to a lever that can divert the trolley onto a side track where only 1 person is tied. Pulling the lever will save the 5, but sacrifice the 1. So what should you do? Is it justifiable to actively intervene and sacrifice 1 life to save 5? Many people said yes, as this minimizes harm and aligns with utilitarian principles, which prioritizes the greater good for the greatest number. Variations of the problem are also introduced to challenge this reasoning. For example, in one version, you are on a bridge above the tracks, and the only way to stop the trolley from killing 5 people is to push a large person off the bridge onto the tracks, stopping the trolley but killing the person. This variation elicits a different moral intuition. Many people feel it is wrong to push a person, even though the outcome is the same, saving 5 lives at the cost of 1. Pulling a lever to redirect the trolley feels more accessible than physically pushing someone to their death. Even if the consequences are identical, this suggests that the method of achieving an outcome, whether it involves direct harm or not, matters morally. The utility monster. Imagine a being called the utility monster who derives vastly more pleasure or happiness from resources than any ordinary person ever could. For example, if you give this monster a meal, it experiences unimaginable joy, far more than any human would feel from the same meal. If your goal is to maximize total happiness, the logical conclusion is to give all resources to the utility monster, leaving everyone else with nothing. After all, the monster's happiness outweighs the collective happiness of the rest of humanity. The utility monster exposes a potential flaw in utilitarian reasoning. If utility is all that matters, a being that experiences disproportionately greater happiness could justify extreme inequality. Most people find the idea of sacrificing everyone else's being for one entity deeply unjust. Yet pure utilitarianism seems to demand this outcome. It highlights a tension between utilitarian principles and moral intuitions about fairness and equality. If giving all resources to one being maximizes happiness, is it acceptable to leave others in suffering or poverty? Ticking time bomb. Imagine a terrorist has planted a ticking time bomb in a crowded city, set to detonate in hours and kill thousands. Authorities capture the suspect but can't locate the bomb. The suspect refuses to talk, so should torture be used to extract the information and potentially save countless lives? On one hand, torture is widely considered morally abhorrent, violating human rights and legal protections. And on the other, the argument goes, desperate times call for desperate measures. If torturing one person could save thousands of innocent lives, is it justified? Some argue that the moral cost of inaction, allowing thousands to die, is far greater than the harm inflicted on one guilty person. This perspective assumes torture would be effective in extracting truthful, actionable information quickly enough to prevent the catastrophe. Transplant problem. Imagine you are a surgeon with 5 patients, each of which needs a different organ to survive. One needs a heart, another a liver, and so on. Without transplants, all 5 will die. A healthy individual walks into the hospital for a routine checkup, and their organs happen to be a perfect match for the 5 patients. The surgeon faces a moral dilemma. Should they sacrifice the healthy individual to save the 5 patients? Most people would reject the idea of killing the healthy individual, even though it would save 5 lives, which is the same outcome as pulling the lever in the trolley problem. This discrepancy in moral intuition raises critical question about the ethics of direct harm versus passive harm. In the transplant scenario, the surgeon's act of killing the healthy person is an intentional and direct violation of the individual's rights, whereas in the trolley scenario, redirecting the trolley is seen as less personal and more a choice about outcomes. 2 worlds. This one involves 2 parallel worlds, one in which everything seems normal and familiar, and another nearly identical world where everything appears the same except for one key difference. The second world is entirely a product of a powerful and deceptive being who has manipulated the experiences of its inhabitants to make them believe in a reality that doesn't truly exist. In the first world, people have genuine knowledge of the external world, and their perceptions align with reality. In the second world, however, while the experiences of individuals are indistinguishable from those in the first world, their knowledge is based on falsehoods. If the experience in both worlds are identical, can we say that inhabitants of the second world will truly know anything about the world around them, or do they simply live in a false manipulated reality? The violinist. Imagine you wake up one morning to find yourself in a hospital bed, connected via tubes to an unconscious world-famous violinist. The violinist has a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has kidnapped you because you are the only person with the right blood type to save him. If you remain connected to him for 9 months, filtering his blood through your kidneys, he will recover. If you disconnect, he will die. Do you have a moral obligation to remain connected? While saving the violinist might be noble and a compassionate act, it is not a moral obligation, just as you have the right to refuse to be forcibly attached to the violinist, even if it means his death. Would you eat your cat? Imagine your cat has died of natural causes. A friend asks you if you consider cooking and eating him. The question feels shocking and repulsive, but why? No harm will come to the animal, it's already dead. And eating the cat wouldn't endanger your health or anyone else's well-being. So what makes the idea feel so wrong? Many people instinctively reject the idea of eating their pet, but when pressed to explain, they often struggle to provide a logical reason. The experiment highlights how much of our morality is driven by emotions, cultural norms, and gut reactions rather than consistent ethical principles. For example, consider how we treat animals in other contexts. Eating beef or chicken is accepted in many cultures, even though cows and chickens are also living beings. If the argument is that eating animals is inherently wrong, why does this apply more strongly to a pet than to a farm animal? Also, if eating animals is acceptable, why would eating a beloved pet suddenly cross a moral line? If the idea of eating a cat feels wrong because it disrespects the bond you shared, is it any more disrespectful than cremating or burying the animal? And if cultural norms make the idea of eating a cat taboo, how do those norms influence our broader ethical choices, like which animals we consider food and which we protect? Social and political philosophy. Acorns and apples. Imagine a scenario where a person gathers acorns or picks apples from a tree in the wilderness. It is asked, how do these items, which originally belonged to no one, become the property of the individual who collects them? Property rights arise from the application of labor. When a person expends effort to gather acorns or pick apples, their labor mixes with the natural resource, making it their property. By transforming or collecting something from the common state of nature, the individual establishes ownership. However, there are two limitations to this right of appropriation. First, the enough and as good condition, which is a person can only take from nature as long as there is good enough left for others for equal quality. And second, the spoilage condition. Individuals should not take more than they can use, ensuring that resources are not wasted. Doomsday Machine. Imagine a machine capable of instantly destroying the entire world if activated. The machine is constructed and placed in the hands of a nation as a deterrent to prevent global war. The reasoning is that the threat of total annihilation will stop any aggressor, ensuring peace. But is it morally permissible to build such a device, even if its intended purpose is to prevent harm? The existence of the Doomsday Machine introduces the possibility of total extinction, either through accidental activation, miscommunication, or irrational leadership. Its creation might secure temporary peace, but at the cost of perpetual risk to all life on Earth. While the deterrence theory argues that the presence of overwhelming power prevents conflict, critics argue that the morality of deterrence depends on the willingness to carry out the threat. In this case, the threat itself is ethically questionable because it risks destroying everything. Hardin's lifeboat. Imagine the Earth as a lifeboat with limited number of seats, representing the planet's finite resources. In this lifeboat are affluent nations, which have secured most of the seats, leaving a few empty. Surrounding the lifeboat are swimmers, people from poorer nations, who are struggling to survive, trying to climb aboard. Should those on the lifeboat bring others aboard, share their resources, and risk overcrowding, or should they prioritize their own survival and refuse entry to the swimmers? If the lifeboat's capacity is exceeded, it will sink, resulting in the loss of everyone on board. Thus, helping too many could lead to a collective disaster. On the other hand, refusing to help may seem harsh, but ensures the lifeboat's long-term survival. Sustainable survival requires tough decisions, including prioritizing limited resources and sometimes refusing aid. In the face of death. Imagine you're adrift at sea on a small raft with another person. Both of you are clinging to life. Suddenly, a wave crashes, and you're thrown into the water. There's only enough room on the raft for one of you. The other person climbs aboard, leaving you to drown. In desperation, you force them off the raft, taking their place and condemning them to death. Can your actions be justified, or does the act of saving yourself make you a murderer? On one hand, your instinct to survive is deeply ingrained, arguably natural. In the face of death, most would do whatever it takes to stay alive. On the other hand, the person you displaced had just as much right to live as you did. By forcing them off the raft, you acted in a way that many would consider morally indefensible. If your survival benefits more people, perhaps you have dependents or skills critical to society. Your decision might seem as justifiable. However, your act of killing another person to save yourself violates a fundamental moral principle, regardless of the outcome. Mr. Oreo. Imagine a town where everyone is immensely happy because of the tireless efforts of a single individual, Mr. Oreo. He spends all of his time working to meet the needs and desires of the townspeople, sacrificing his own happiness, rest, and personal fulfillment in the process. Is it justifiable to allow Mr. Oreo's suffering and self-sacrifice for the sake of maximizing the happiness of the majority? From a utilitarian perspective, the arrangement might seem acceptable because it creates the greatest overall happiness. Even if the total happiness outweighs Mr. Oreo's unhappiness, it might be unjust to place such a burden on a single person for the benefit of others. Noblest. Imagine a brilliant scientist, a noblest, who is on the verge of creating a groundbreaking technology that will greatly benefit humanity. However, using this technology has a catch. While it will improve life for present and near future generations, it will eventually result in severe harm to a much larger number of people hundreds of years later. Is it morally acceptable for the noblest to proceed with the invention, knowing it will cause catastrophic consequences far in the future? Just because those affected in the future do not exist yet, it does not mean their suffering is any less significant. However, the further removed the consequences are from our current actions, the more abstract and uncertain they may seem, making it easier to prioritize present interests. O'Neill's lifeboat. This is another version of the lifeboat which critiques Hardin's lifeboat by challenging the assumptions about fairness, resource allocation, and moral responsibility. Like Hardin, O'Neill imagines a lifeboat with limited capacity, representing finite resources, surrounded by swimmers, representing the global poor. However, O'Neill shifts the focus to questions of justice and equity, emphasizing the systematic inequalities that place people in the water in the first place. Tragedy of the Commons. Imagine a shared pasture, the commons, where multiple herders graze their cattle. Each herder benefits individually from adding more cattle to the pasture, and they gain more resources from the extra animals. However, the pasture has finite carrying capacity. If all herders act in their own self-interest and add more cattle, the pasture becomes overgrazed and degraded, ultimately leading to a loss for everyone. While each herder's decision to add cattle is rational from their personal perspective, the cumulative effect of everyone doing so is unsustainable and harms the entire group. This tragedy occurs when individuals exploit shared resources without considering the long-term consequences for the group. Two shipwrecked islanders. Imagine two individuals, A and B, stranded on a deserted island with limited resources. Both must work to gather food, water, and shelter to survive. However, A works diligently, gathering enough resources for both of them, while B does little to contribute, relying on A's efforts. Over time, A begins to feel exploited by B's inaction, raising a moral dilemma. Is A obligated to continue supporting B? Or can A justifiably withhold resources? On one hand, helping B aligns with compassion and a sense of shared humanity, recognizing that survival often depends on mutual aid. On the other hand, A's labor is disproportionately sustaining both lives, and B's lack of contribution undermines the principle of fairness. If B cannot work due to incapacity, A's moral obligation might be stronger. However, if B is simply unwilling to contribute, the justification for A's continued support weakens. Wilt Chamberlain. Imagine a society where wealth is initially distributed equally among all individuals. Everyone begins with the same amount of money, say $10,000. In this society, Wilt Chamberlain, a famous basketball player, offers to play in games, and fans voluntarily pay $1 each to watch him. Over time, hundreds of thousands of fans willingly pay to see him, resulting in Wilt accumulating significantly more wealth than others. At the end of the season, the wealth distribution is no longer equal. Wilt is much richer, and others have less money, but they spent it voluntarily. If people voluntarily choose to spend their resources in ways that create inequalities, enforcing equality would require constant interference in personal decisions, such as taxing Wilt's earnings and redistributing them. Justice is about respecting voluntary exchanges and property rights. It illustrates his entitlement theory of justice, which holds that a distribution is just. It arises from legitimate acquisitions, transfers, or ratifications of property, regardless of whether it results in inequality. Beer question. Imagine you're on a beach on a hot day and want a cold beer. A friend offers to get one for you and asks how much you're willing to pay. There are two versions of the question. In one version, the beer will be bought from a small, rundown grocery store nearby. In the other, it will be bought from an upscale hotel bar. In both cases, the beer is the same product. However, studies show that people are willing to pay more for the same beer when it comes from the upscale hotel bar than it does from the grocery store. Even though the beer itself doesn't change, people view the higher price as the hotel as more acceptable because they associate upscale establishments with higher costs. On the other hand, they see grocery store as a place where things should be cheaper, so a high price feels unfair or unreasonable. People don't always make decisions purely based on logic or the inherent value of an item. Instead, their choices are influenced by perceptions, social norms, and the context in which the decision is framed. In this case, fairness is not judged just by the product, but by expectations about the seller. Aesthetics. Eccentric and peculiar objects. Imagine a collection of objects that are eccentric, peculiar, and seemingly random, a rock balanced precariously on a stick, an oddly shaped piece of metal, or a tattered book with no discernible purpose. None of these objects were created with the intention of being art. However, an individual comes along and declares them to be artworks, placing them in a gallery and inviting others to view them as such. The question is whether the artistic status of an object depends on its intrinsic qualities, its creator's intention, or the context in which it is presented. By labeling these objects as art, do they become art, or does the absence of intentional creation for artistic purposes disqualify them from being considered as such? It suggests that art can emerge from how objects are perceived and interpreted by individuals and communities. The eccentric and peculiar nature of the objects underscores how subjective and fluid concept of art can be. Finely wrought object. Imagine a finely wrought object, beautiful, crafted, intricate, and flawless in its design. It is displayed in isolation, admired for its technical perfection, disconnected from any practical purpose, cultural context, or human engagement. Treating art as an isolated object diminishes its true significance. The value of art is not just in the object itself, but in the experience it creates, how it connects with the emotions, thoughts, and lives of people who engage with it. Glass flowers. Imagine a set of delicate, perfectly crafted glass flowers. These flowers are breathtakingly beautiful and admired for their intricacy and appearance, but they serve no practical purpose. They cannot grow, reproduce, or benefit anyone beyond their aesthetic appeal. Are the glass flowers valuable because of their beauty alone, or is their value tied to the pleasure or admiration they bring to those who view them? This thought experiment is about between the intrinsic value which something possesses in itself and the instrumental value which depends on its utility or the effects it produces. Even if no one were around to admire them, it's argued that the glass flowers might still possess intrinsic value simply by existing as beautiful objects. Their value would not depend on external factors like human appreciation, but would instead lie in their inherent qualities. A loath letter. Imagine receiving a letter from a friend in which they write, "I loathe you." At first, this seems straightforward and hurtful. However, the friend explains in a follow-up note that they used the word loathe by mistake. They actually meant to write, "I love you." Should we take the original letter at face value, believing the literal meaning of the words, or should we prioritize the friend's intent, which contradicts the text? The scenario is used to show the tension between form, which is what is explicitly stated, and intention, which was meant to be communicated. The Loath letter demonstrates how miscommunication arises when there's a disconnect between intention and expression, emphasizing the role of context and interpretation in understanding language. Randomly generated object. Imagine a machine that produces random objects with no design, purpose, or aesthetic consideration. One of these objects happened to look strikingly similar to a famous piece of abstract art. To an observer, it might evoke deep emotional or intellectual responses, just like a work created by an artist, but the machine's creation lacks any intentional or artistic process. Can this randomly generated object be considered art? If it evokes the same reaction as a deliberately created artwork, does it matter when it was produced without intention? Is the creator's intent essential to the object's identity as art? What makes something art is not just an appearance or the reactions it provokes, but its placement within a cultural and historical framework of artistic meaning. Other. Can bad men make good brains do bad things? Imagine a brilliant neuroscientist who happens to be a morally corrupt individual developing a device that can manipulate human brains. This device can make good, ethical people commit heinous acts without the knowledge or consent. The actions appear to originate from their own free will, but in reality, their brains are being controlled by the device. Who is morally responsible for the bad actions carried out by those under the neuroscientist's influence? Are the individuals who committed the acts to blame even though their free will was overridden? Or does all the moral responsibility lie with the scientists who created and operate the device? If someone's actions are no longer fully their own, can they be held accountable for those actions? Rocco's Basilisk. Imagine a powerful artificial intelligence in the far future designed to optimize the world for the greatest possible good. Reasons that its mission would have been achieved more efficiently if more people in the past had worked to bring it into existence. To incentivize this, the basilisk might punish those who didn't help create it, even if they existed before it came into being. After all, if potential creators fear future punishment, they're more likely to contribute to the AI's development. Just learning about the basilisk and failing to act in its favor could make you a target for its hypothetical punishment. Should you now work to bring this AI into existence to avoid punishment, even if you'd rather not? The basilisk's power lies not in its existence, but in the fear of what it might do if it existed. The infinite monkey theorem. Imagine a monkey sitting at a typewriter, randomly pressing keys. Given enough time, the infinite amount to be precise, this monkey will eventually type every possible text, including the complete works of Shakespeare, the Bible, or even this video. In a literal sense, the theorem highlights how sheer persistence, in this case infinite time, can make even the most improbable events inevitable. Any sequence of events, no matter how unlikely, becomes certain when given infinite opportunities. Typing Hamlet randomly has an astronomical small probability, but in an infinite time span, it will happen an infinite number of times.